Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Crucible. I am your host, Zen Shapiro. Thank you all for being with us tonight. Very excited. Got another great debate lined up. This one has been pushed back and rescheduled a couple of times, but we're finally doing it today. We've got Luigi, who is returning to the Crucible to take on Pinesap, who is making his Crucible debut. They're going to be debating the doctrine of the Papacy, and specifically, is the Roman Catholic or the Eastern Orthodox view of infallibility what is in accordance with the early church? So should be a lot of fun. Pinesap is a Roman Catholic, Luigi Eastern Orthodox, both guys very well studied, well practiced in their craft, so should be pretty high level. Hope you guys are excited. Before we get into it, I want to remind you guys, please do all the YouTube shit, like, share, subscribe, post your comments, participate in the live chat. Helps us in the algorithm, and if you want to send support, you can do so via YouTube or the Dono Chat link, which is pinned in the top of the live chat. All super chats will be read at the end of the stream, and you can also send support by becoming a channel member on YouTube or gift your channel memberships. Send your support. We appreciate it very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be right back with both of our debaters. And we're back. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got Pinesap on the left and Luigi on the right. Welcome, welcome. Thank you guys for being here. Pinesap, before we get into it, take a second, shout yourself out, tell everybody where they can find you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Pinesap, as some of you might know. I'm a Catholic apologist online. I mostly love to handle the papacy, church history, and kind of different controversies and what have you. My main places that you can follow me is at Pinesap3Wask on Twitter, or X, Pinesap3 on Instagram, my channel Pinesap on YouTube, and then finally my Telegram, The Narrow Way.
All right, thank you for being here. And Luigi, take a second, shout yourself out, and tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, what's going on, everybody? I'm lang.luigi on Instagram, langluigi_ on Twitter, and Mere Christian on TikTok. I'm an Orthodox Christian, passionate about Orthodox apologetics and theology. So.
All right, and before we get into it, I want to remind you guys one last time we are going to be taking callers tonight. So if you want to call in at the end of the stream and ask your questions to either debater, you can do so by getting a stream link from the mods in the Discord. So the Discord link should be in the live chat somewhere. Go in there, get the stream link from the mods. You can call in, ask a question to either debater directly. We are going to be limited on time, so get in there as soon as possible. But we are going to be taking callers. The structure of the debate, the format will be formalized like it was the last time, though we are going to have a dedicated segment for open dialogue so both guys can kind of spar back and forth. I know some people had, some issues or complaints about the format of the last one. It was a little bit rushed and too condensed. And I understand that, so we are going to have open dialogue in this one, but it will still be a little bit structured. The format is 12-minute openings on each side, followed by 5-minute rebuttals, 10-minute cross-examinations, and 30 minutes of open dialogue, and then we'll have closing statements and Q&A at the end. We did agree backstage that Pinesap will be going first, so Pinesap, whenever you're ready, you have 12 minutes on the clock. I'll start it. You said you wanted to share your screen, So
Yeah,
whenever you're ready,
thank you. I'm gonna share my screen, and then once I share my screen, I will let you know when I got my speech pulled up.
Yep.
And then
I'll
we're
start
good
the
to
clock
go.
when you share your screen. Yep.
Perfect. So my do you see my screen now?
Yep.
Perfect. And then let me pull
All
up my notes, and then I should be good to go.
All right. Clock starts now.
When our Lord promised to St. Peter the Apostle that he would pray so that his faith will not fail, Luke 22:32, that was a promise for a charism of infallibility which would be active after the church was bought with blood, Acts 20:28, so that his successors would protect the deposit of faith until the second coming. The point of this debate is to show that the doctrine of infallibility was known and existed in the first millennium church in a way which can be demonstrated with the utmost clarity. The patristic reasoning for this doctrine can be formalized as follows. Rome is the divinely instituted head, root, or font of the church, and the church is indefectible. Then papal infallibility is true. Rome is the divinely instituted head, root, or font of the church, or fount of the church. The church is indefectible. Therefore, papal infallibility is true. This should be pretty obvious. If we can demonstrate that the visible church cannot fail and it has a single principle of unity which defines whether you are in or out of the body, then that head, which is a necessary constituent of the body, cannot ever lead the entire church to error and cast off from the rest of the church. The first premise of this argument can be shown easily among the explicit reasoning of certain popes when it comes to their views on the divine institution of the papacy and their association with said office with the inability to err and its perpetuity. As early as 382, during a council held in Rome, Pope St. Damasus says the following and notes that the papacy is divinely instituted, it's set apart from the other churches by his office, and that the papal see is free from error in some sense. In the next century, St. Leo gives us a little bit more specificity that the Pope, in virtue of his divine office, can decree certain things due to his papal office, which we will later show is the ability to bind the whole church to a certain defined doctrine. Finally, we have the letter of Pope St. Agatho to Constantine IV, addressed to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, which gives a clear statement of the infallibility of the Pope based on the divine institution of the papacy. Now that we've established the fact that the divine institution is the basis by which the papacy stays immaculate in doctrine, and thus popes cannot be deposed on the basis of error, we move on to the notion of headship. In 1 Corinthians 11:3, we read that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. Very early on, the fathers viewed the church as having its ultimate head in Christ, and per each level of the church's hierarchy, a head which becomes the principle of unity for its body and its members. Ultimately, the episcopacy originates in and must be united to its head. Without its head, its members shrivel up and die. Many of these notions can be found as early as the 3rd or 4th centuries, and you can read them on the slide here. In all of these examples, we see that there is a unity of the episcopacy, which is undivided with its principle of unity, or its ongoing foundation being its head, which it cannot do anything without. Now, you may object and say that these quotes do not show that there is a necessity to be in communion with Rome, but this is actually explicitly stated by St. Jerome when he says that the seed of Peter is the Ark of Noah and the solution to any schism. This position is further strengthened by the Formula Formidus, a letter sent to all the archbishops of the East with the requirement to sign on to a formula defining the church as being made up of those in communion with Rome and not to ever concelebrate with anyone outside it. Finally, we have the perpetuity of the church, which Luigi and I both agree upon. Although I have some quotes up here, you can pause and read which exegete Matthew 16 as applying perpetuity to the papal office. Now that we have established the patristic reasoning behind papal infallibility, that there is a principle of unity which keeps the episcopacy unified and is indefectible and cannot teach error, we can demonstrate this happening in real time in history. In order to do this, we must define two ways by which the Pope can exercise his office as teacher and head of the universal church in which he is protected from error. Ex cathedra, where the Pope defines solemnly on faith or morals in his capacity as the teacher of all Christians, and via an ecumenical council, which requires papal ratification either before, during, or after a council. Luigi's task now, in order to defeat my position, is to contest that neither of these modes of teaching by the Pope have occurred in the first millennium. However, this task will be hard to uphold just by looking at 3 different councils and seeing whether or not certain criteria can be used to exclude robber councils and include other councils. It also needs to be noted that the Pope originally operated in an environment with an emperor not incentivized to work lockstep with the West. And as Status Cognitum shows, the church is like Christ, both divine and human. So the Pope always works with human means and is limited by certain human obstacles like temporal power. Due to a variety of reasons, in 430 AD, an official campaign to depose Nestorius began, and Cyril sent the third letter to Nestorius and the 12 chapters against Nestorius, translated into Latin to Pope St. Celestine, who replied back telling Cyril that Nestorius had been cast out of the Universal Catholic Church and that Cyril was to be united to the holy head of the Blessed Apostle Peter. So, already prior to the coming council the next year, the acceptance of the 12 chapters and the anathematization of Nestorius was ratified by the Pope. Pope St. Celestine wanted Cyril to finish the job. However, for those who believe that universal consent is the method by which we determine what council is ecumenical, you have a problem. When the first few people showed up to the council, Count Cadidian, the imperial representative who was supposed to start the council, was harassed by St. Cyril to start it before the arrival of Constantinople and Antioch. During this time, Nestorius refused to come to the church where the council was convened because he said Cyril was attempting to reside judgment over the council, which was unfair since he was also Nestorius's primary accuser. Also at this time, Ephesus was a stronghold for Theotokos respecters. And Nestorius's party in a letter described that they were stoned by lackeys disguised as monks and nearly killed. Now Cyril, after chasing Cadidian away, started the council, and without debate, him and 198 bishops remaining in the church voted to depose Nestorius. By the time John of Antioch came to Ephesus, he was furious that the council started without Antiochian representation or most of Constantinople present, and the later sessions condemned Cyril as a heretic. The confusion between the reports given by Cyril's party and John's party made it so that the emperor did not view anything as being accomplished at this council. To this day, according to canonical rules and the standards of Nicaea, Ephesus 431 is considered a robber council by the Church of the East because compared to Nicaea, it lacked a canonical imperial opening, free debate between parties, and unanimity and ecumenical representation. This is why papal ratification makes sense. Ephesus Session 1 was confirmed twice, once by Pope St. Celestine before the council, and a year after the council by Pope St. Sixtus III. So that view easily explains why the council is considered ecumenical. Yet, if we need universal consent or another council to interpret Ephesus and figure out what part of the council to accept, we need to actually go into the future to 449, where Ephesus Session 1 was accepted by the whole church in a general council you don't accept. And this council, for the most part, is about as canonical as Ephesus. We can debate this later, but the arguments for it not being a robber council that do not mention that it was struck down by a pope do not work. Ephesus too was called by an emperor and had a large representation of all parts of the church and was called to depose certain bishops who were considered as Nestorians and tried to overturn Flavian's condemnation of the heretic Eutyches. By every metric outside Pope St. Leo striking it down as a robber synod, this council should be considered as ecumenical. In fact, after this event, Theodoret of Cyrus, one of the deposed, asked Leo to overturn the deposition and have Eutyches and Dioscorus deposed. He saw the Pope as authoritative over the council. All of this started due to a letter Leo wrote where he expected the entire church to accept it without a council, known as the Tome, which outlined the heresy of Eutyches. However, after many failed attempts at its implementation according to the intention of Pope St. Leo, as well as the death of Flavian and Emperor Theodosius II, Leo, who did not want to call a council, finally allowed one to occur as convened under Emperor Marcian, so that Dioscorus could be condemned and deposed by the end of it, and every bishop would be forced to accept his tome. This council was essentially more extreme than other second millennia examples of papal authority, such as the trial of Martin Luther, as you can see on this slide. At the end of the day, this council, while accepted by all the popes, left a problem in the East. Non-Chalcedonians and Chalcedonians took turns hashing things out. At some point, it got so bad that the East retracted Chalcedon, and it caused a schism for 35 years that was only accepted once the East signed onto the formula of Pope St. Hormisdas. Anyways, papal ratification clearly shows who was in the right, unlike reception theory, as David Earnhardt has conceded, was only clear 100 years after Chalcedon.
Here, I'll pause the clock while you get that video. I know you said you wanted to play something.
Oh, is the video not playing?
There's no audio coming through.
Oh my goodness, sorry about that. Can I thought thought I had set it to.
Here.
I believe you. I believe you. I believe you
No,
that
that's
he
fine.
conceived it.
I do want to play that video though. It is very important. Oh, I guess I didn't click the. My goodness.
Yeah,
sorry.
just make sure it says share system audio.
It did.
Yeah. All right, try again.
Chalcedon in the church. There were Origenists in the church. So there were like different groups that were in the church at the time. That's why I'm saying it's difficult for me to argue that Chalcedon was epistemically speaking, that it was a council that we can say is 100% dogmatic. And about the Pope and the East, Pope versus East, that's kind of like, I think this is kind of like something mentioned that, would you agree with me, Subdeacon Daniel, that we were part of the same church, we just didn't accept what council was the ecumenical one until the Jacobite schism? Will you say that we were part of the same church? Would you agree with that? And so, there was I'm making this point not to like make an objection, just to like inform the viewers. Like the schism happened over time. So many people think that, oh, Chalcedon happened, instant schism. Well, actually, no. It happened a century later. So there were Nestorianizers in the church. There were people that rejected Chalcedon in the church. There were Origenists in the church. So there were like different groups that were in the church at the time. That's why I'm saying it's difficult for me to argue that Chalcedon was epistemically speaking, that it was a council that we can say is 100% dogmatic. And about the Pope and the East, Pope versus East, that's kind of like, I think this is kind of like something mentioned that.
Okay, perfect. And that's it.
All right. Thank you for that. Thank you for that opening statement, Pinesap. Luigi, whenever you're ready, you have 12 minutes on the clock for your opening statement. Okay.
Okay, I'm ready. Right. Today I will be arguing that the Church of the First Millennium held the ecclesiology that, 1,000 years later, is still held by the modern Eastern Orthodox Church. I recommend everyone watch my presentation during my debate with Voice of Reason, as I will be building on the content presented during that debate. There's only so much time I can cover in 12 minutes, so for this presentation, I will be going straight for the kill shots. First, I will be showing a case study of a universally binding decree that had only the participation of a single papal legate and mandated communion with several churches, none of which were Rome. Second, I will be demonstrating that while attempting to assert his apostolic authority over an ecumenical council, Pope Vigilius did indeed err on faith and morals. And finally, I will be showing that common papal honorifics, such as the title vicar, are applied to individuals other than the Pope, thus making all the common honorifics used by Roman Catholics a special pleading fallacy. The First Council of Constantinople was arguably the most important of the 7 ecumenical councils. It finally crushed the Arian controversy and produced the creed now recited across all of Christendom, minus the Filioque, of course. The only participation from Rome was St. Ascolius of Thessalonica. Otherwise, the council was fully driven by Eastern theologians, as was the case for all 6 of the other ecumenical councils. Following the council, Emperor St. Theodosius published the following universal decree, quote, "We command that all churches be forthwith delivered up to the bishops who confess the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost to be of one majesty and power, of the same glory and of one splendor, making no distinction by any profane division, but rather harmony by the assertion of the Trinity of the persons and the unity of the Godhead. To the bishops who are associated in communion with the bishop of the Church of Constantinople, and the bishop of the city of Alexandria, and the bishop of Laodicea, and Diodorus, and the bishop of Tarsus, the bishop of Iconium, the bishop of Antioch, the bishop of Caesarea, the bishop of Melitena, the bishop of Nyssa, the bishop of Cynthia, the bishop of Marcianopolis. Those who are of the communion and fellowship of these approved priests ought to be admitted to possess the Catholic churches, but all who dissent from the communion of the faith of those whom the special list has named ought to be expelled from the churches as manifest heretics." This is found in the Theodosian Code. So in short, Emperor St. Theodosius published a decree that bound the entire Catholic Church to a particular doctrine, mandated communion with Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople, and failed to even mention Rome. It was this same council that in Canon 3, Constantinople is crowned the title New Rome, and Flavian was appointed as the Bishop of Antioch against the wishes of the Pope. In fact, from the year 394 to 399, almost every church, including some Western churches, was in communion with Flavian, while Rome was out of communion with him. It wasn't until 399 when Rome, as usual, submitted to the rest of the church. Theodoret states in Church History, Book 5, Chapter 23, quote, "The Western bishops promised to bring their hostility to a close," end quote. The idea that communion with Rome is absolutely necessary to be a Catholic church is utterly ahistorical. So in this singular case study, we see that the universally binding decrees can be published with little papal involvement. Communion with Orthodox doctrine is far more important than communion with Rome. And when Rome is up against the consent of the church, they ultimately submit. Now I will demonstrate that while attempting to bind the whole church at the Fifth Ecumenical Council, Pope Vigilius taught a doctrinal error, meaning he did not err only on matters of fact, but also on faith and morals. So that there is no question that he was attempting to bind the church via his authority as the Apostolic See, I will read the end of his first constitutum written to the council. Quote, "We ordain and decree that it be permitted to no one to write or bring forward anything contradictory to the contents of this constitutum, or after this declaration, bring a new controversy about them. And if anything has already been done in contradiction of this our ordinance, we declare void by the authority of the Apostolic See," end quote. Pope Vigilius concludes his letter by asserting his ultimate authority as the Apostolic See. He says that following this letter, there is to be no new controversy regarding the 3 chapters or the letter to Maurice from Ibas. It is the final declaration to which no one should question, by the authority of the Apostolic See. Not only are Vigilius's lofty claims rejected by the council, but he is excommunicated until he finally repents 2 years later when he releases his second constitutum that retracts the first. In fact, the council states, quote, "We have pronounced that his name is alien to Christians," end quote. But what were the contents of this first constitutum in which Vigilius attempted to bind the church with? He defends a heretical letter from Ibas to Maurice. Yes, not only did he defend the person of Ibas, he defends the contents of the letter. About the letter, he states, quote, "From the reading of the text of the letter produced by his adversary, his writing has been shown to be Catholic," end quote. And again, quote, "We decree and ordain with the authority of our present verdict that, as regards all matters, and in particular the oft-cited letter of the venerable Ibas, the judgment of the fathers in session at Chalcedon is to remain inviolate," end quote. Now, Vigilius erroneously thought Ibas's letter to Maurice was accepted by the Council of Chalcedon, when in fact the council actually accepted Ibas's letter from the clergy of Edessa. This is an error he corrects in his second constitutum, when he acknowledges the letter to Maurice is Nestorian. In fact, he blames the devil for deceiving him. Quote, Vigilius writes to Eutychius, Patriarch of Constantinople, blames the enemy of the human race for deceiving him into writing against the 3 chapters, and then annulled the first constitution by the authority of our present letter, end quote. This is in Price's Acts of Constantinople, pages 110 through 111, and the defense of Ibas's letter is found on pages 199 through 205. There is simply no way to nuance around this. Vigilius attempted to bind the church to a doctrinal error and then blames the devil for it before ultimately submitting to the council's decrees. This single-handedly falsifies the Vatican I papacy. Finally, I want to show how common papal honorifics used to justify Vatican I in the first millennium are simply special pleading. They could just as easily be used to justify the emperor and even other patriarchal sees as having Vatican I level power and honor. The Pope calls the emperor Christ's vicar of the world. Quote, "Your clemency is the sanctuary of the public, so that through your insistence, God has ordered you to govern the world as his vicar," end quote. It's Pope Anastasius II, Epistle 1, letter to the emperor. Pope Agatho applies Matthew 16 to the Orthodox Empire of Constantinople during the 6th Ecumenical Council. Quote, "And with the Almighty who rules you, O most devout emperor, you decide because you are appointed by God. Rejoice, O city of Zion, summit of the world and empire. Constantine ornamented you with purple and crowned you with faith, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against your Orthodox empire," end quote. Papal Primacy, page 50. The emperor elsewhere is called the divine and inviolable head on page 308 of Price's work on the 3rd Ecumenical Council. Writing to the Pope, the 6th Ecumenical Council says, quote, "For these decrees, the Holy Spirit by his grace dictated to the tongue of the imperial pen," end quote. Gregory II calls Pope Leo III the, quote, "king and head of Christians," end quote. Pope Adrian even says in letter 8 that he and his synod are the spiritual children of Charlemagne. How about other patriarchal sees? Let's start with the term apostolic see. This was not an exclusive title. During the Council of Ephesus, in its July 16th session, St. Juvenal of Jerusalem calls his own patriarchate an apostolic see. Eastern patriarchates were also in passing called apostolic sees during Nicaea too. Additionally, both Justin the Emperor, who enforced the formula of Hormisdas, and St. Augustine say that being in communion with Jerusalem is absolutely necessary to be a Catholic church, and no one would dare break communion with them. Justin says to Pope Hormisdas, while demanding he compromises on the formula for Hormisdas, quote, unite everywhere the venerable churches, and especially the Church of Jerusalem, on which all bestow their goodwill, as being the mother of the Christian name, so that no one dares to separate himself from that church, end quote. Of note, Hormisdas complies with the emperor. St. Augustine, by the same token, quote, if you be Catholic churches, communicate with that church from which the gospel is spread abroad over the whole earth. Communicate with Jerusalem. Christ made there the beginning of the preaching of his name, and you shrink back with horror from having communion with that city. No marvel that being cut off, you hate the root. Homily 2 on the first epistle of John. St. Clement even calls Jerusalem the bishop of bishops. While on the topic of St. Augustine, he also states that decisions made by Rome are not final and can always be reversed by an ecumenical council. Quote, well, let us suppose that those bishops who decided the case at Rome were not good judges. There still remains a plenary council of the universal church, in which these judges themselves might be put on their defense, so that if they were convicted of mistake, their decisions might be reversed, end quote. St. Augustine, letter 43, paragraph 19. So much for Rome has spoken, the case is closed. What about the authority of Peter? Not only is the patristic consensus that every bishop is Peter, listen to this quote about Antioch from St. John Chrysostom. Quote, moreover, God himself had great care for Antioch. At all events, the master of the whole church, Peter, to whose hands he committed the keys of heaven, whom he commanded to do and bear all. He commanded to spend a long time here. Thus, in his sight, Antioch was equivalent to the whole world. But since I have mentioned Peter, I have perceived a fifth crown woven from him. And that is this man, Ignatius of Antioch, who succeeded Peter in power, end quote. Additionally, St. Basil calls Antioch the head of all churches in letter 67. Universal titles, such as ecumenical patriarch, are used to refer to both Constantinople and Alexandria throughout church history. Finally, one of the most crushing quotes of all is from the Roman Catholic's very own Eighth Ecumenical Council. Quote, for where will you seek refuge, or where will you go? God established his church in the 5 patriarchates and decreed in his gospels that they would never at any time totally fall away, since they are the heads of the church. For the saying, and the gates of the underworld will not prevail against it, has this meaning. If 2 were to fall away, people are to have recourse to 3. And if 3 fall away, they are to have recourse to 2. While if it so happened that 4 were to fall away, the single one remaining in the head of all, Christ our God, would call back again the remnant of the body of the church. This quote is so damning to the Roman Catholic position because it applies Matthew 16 to all 5 patriarchs, says they will never fall away, and then goes on to say that if 4 fall away, the one that is upholding orthodoxy would become the head, and Christ would call back the 4 patriarchs. Notice it doesn't pick out Rome. The quote implies any of the 5 sees could become the head of the church in the scenario of mass apostasy. To conclude, we see from Constantinople I that universal decrees can be executed without a mention of the Pope, and that communion with orthodoxy is far more important than communion with Rome, despite Unum Sanctum and Vatican I stating communion with Rome is absolutely necessary. We see from the case study of Pope Vigilius that he erred on a matter of faith and morals while attempting to bind the universal church, thus violating Vatican I papal indefectibility. And finally, we see from the honorifics applied to the emperor and other patriarchs that common Vatican I proof texts are a simple case of special pleading. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that opening statement, Luigi. It went about 20 or 30 seconds over, so
my
it's okay. If you guys are okay.
Well,
I was gonna...
to be fair to Luigi, the video that I played kind of went long, so he can have that time back.
Yeah.
That's totally fine.
Okay. All right, so we're going to get into rebuttal segments. So each of you will get 5 minutes, starting with Pinesap, and then we'll go to cross-exam. So Pinesap, whenever you're ready, you have 5 minutes on the clock for your rebuttal.
Awesome. Are you good now?
Yeah, yep, go ahead.
Awesome. So it's kind of interesting that Luigi brought up Constantinople I in sort of affirming that the synod happened without Rome, because from anywhere that I can recall in church history, it was never declared that Rome had a different faith from not initially approving the council. And in fact, Luigi's own John II of Kiev, who wrote a letter to Pope Clement at the time, I think it was Clement IV, shortly kind of after the 1054 schism, actually remarks how the popes from the first ecumenical council to the seventh ecumenical council confirmed these separate councils. This is actually in the Orthodox Patristic Witness Against Catholicism, in which he's writing this letter and saying that it is the Pope of Rome who ultimately confirms these councils, similar to that of Saint Nicephorus, Saint Theodore the Studite, and Saint Stephen the Younger around the time of Nicaea too. Now, it's also curious that he brings up the Theodosian Code, because the same Theodosian Code that had outlined the quote that he had given us also lays out that all the churches of God should have the same faith as Rome and Alexandria. Alexandria had a very orthodox succession up until that point that the code was written, and was known for having great, saints who had proclaimed orthodoxy. But what's curious about that is later statements after the code comes out only affirms that Rome has the unerring faith, as later on Alexandria would of course fall away from the faith. Let me see if I can get to the Meletian Schism if we have time, but I want to skip that for a moment. Going on to Vigilius, Vigilius actually gives a partial condemnation of the contents of the 3 chapters. St. Cyril, and part of the reason why, not in his final decree of the First Constitutum, but kind of the commentary surrounding it, he doesn't condemn the authors by name, is because they had been reconciled at Chalcedon. He had thought that they were in perfectly good standing and peace with the church. So at most, he got a matter of fact wrong, something that is not protected by the charism of papal infallibility. When he goes on to say that he had been deceived by the devil, it is not an admission of heresy, but it is rather that the devil created discord between brothers of the same faith. That is why in that same quote, he says that the council fathers of Constantinople II and himself had always shared the same faith, and that the devil had merely caused confusion in the sort of heat up that had occurred up and leading to the Second Council of Constantinople. Finally, the excommunication, as we all know, was struck from the 8th session of the council, and that was the session that Pope Vigilius actually had accepted, right? His excommunication completely struck out. Needless to say, Justinian also was a complete bully during this council. He deposed any patriarch that would not agree with him and any bishop that would not agree with him. And this is why St. Menas of Constantinople actually goes to Vigilius and apologizes to him for his conduct, because essentially Justinian had forced his hand to issue this condemnation. That hardly a conciliar action as far as I'm concerned. Now, context is what makes the claims, not mere honorifics or words, right? A bishop can be referred to as a head, or another apostolic see can be referred to, as the apostolic see, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the see that presides over the whole church. It's the context of what the letter is speaking about that actually makes it. And in fact, actually post-schism, we acknowledge that there are other Petrine sees established by Peter, but, Rome was, of course, given the presidency or presiding over the entire church. You only need to see the, primary sources around the crusading times of Pope Innocent III referring to Alexandria and Antioch as Petrine sees. This is one of the most ultramontanistic popes that would have lived during the medieval era. Likewise, how much more time do I have?
1 minute.
Okay. Likewise, with Zion, in reference to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, referring to sort of the Orthodox Empire never erring, Zion is a biblical and patristic reference to the church that comes from Hebrews 12:22. And what that acclamation is saying is that so long as the Orthodox Empire holds the Orthodox faith, the gates of hell will never prevail. But it's still centered on the church. This is why during that acclamation, it comes up that the emperor has put on the invincible shield of faith, right? If I'm paraphrasing the statement, right? So as long as the Orthodox Empire conforms to the Orthodox faith, of course, the gates of hell will never prevail against it. And do I have time there?
You have about 10 seconds if you want to say.
Okay, I'll concede my time there.
All right, and Luigi, you've got 5 minutes for your rebuttal. Whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna try to get to as much as I can here. So first, I want to start with the formula for mistos. I mean, I don't know why this is ever used as a papal like proof text. It's actually really embarrassing for the Pope. Patriarch John II of Constantinople edits it, and he says, "I accept the fact that the two most holy churches, that is to say, that of ancient Rome and that of New Rome, should be one see. I admit the see of Peter and that of the imperial city should be one." Now, what Roman Catholics try to say is that this is just him talking about them being in communion together. Except the papal legate Dioscorus writes an apology to the Pope that, quote, John II tried to make it out to be a letter rather than a libellus, and appropriate for a libellus to allow the aforementioned signature. So if this was just, oh, yeah, it's just Rome and Constantinople are in communion together, if that's all he was saying by saying they're one see, then why is the papal legate apologizing to the Pope for allowing that signature? Additionally, immediately after the form of Hormistos, actually, one more point on the form of Hormistos. As I said in my opening statement, the Emperor Justin was actually the one who drove the signatures, and he required of Hormistos that it would be edited. And Hormistos accepts those edits. He says, been set up from the hearts of the apostles, Peter and Paul themselves, in these apostles, the banner of faith. So he accepts the edit where Paul is included in the Hormistos, where initially it was just Peter. And as I read earlier, Justin demanded this be the case in order to include Jerusalem because communing with Jerusalem was considered to be absolutely necessary to be a Catholic church. Additionally, immediately after the formula was finally signed, the Theopaschite formula, a lot of the same bishops that signed it, they rejected Hormistos' view on the Theopaschite formula. So this is clearly not some sort of papal proof text. Again, it was actually very embarrassing for the Pope. I talked about headship. I mean, like just the fact that there's quotes that call Rome the head. I mean, there's a sense in which, of course, they were the first see. All the patriarchs are called heads. The emperor is called head probably more times than the Pope is. So again, that's not a Vatican I proof text. As far as the Council of Ephesus, I want to read St. Cyril. He brought up St. Cyril. Constantly says that Celestine is the head of the Western churches. And he says this, this Price, page 159. The Holy Council of Rome issued a decree excommunicating Nestorius and indeed wrote to your piety, Patriarch John of Antioch. The instructions that must be followed by those who wish to remain in communion with all the West, for we ourselves, Alexandria Synod, shall follow his judgment, fearing to lose the communion of so many. So he was concerned about losing the communion of the West. That was his concern. In fact, when there was a papal honorific read at the Council of Ephesus, St. Cyril immediately replies. He says, they, the Roman legates, have pronounced as representatives of the Apostolic See and of the entire Holy College of the most beloved and most holy bishops of the West. They have given their assent to the verdict against the heretic Nestorius. So it's clear that St. Cyril saw the Roman legates as representing the West. As far as the actual like conciliar and synodal nature of Ephesus and having the consent of all, I mean, this is St. Vincent de Lorenz on how Ephesus was authoritatively interpreted. Quote, that by their consentient determination, the reverence due to ancient truth might be duly and solemnly confirmed. We recorded the names and the number of the fathers, according to whose consentient and unanimous judgment, both the sacred and preliminaries of judicial procedure were expounded, and the rule of divine truth established. So what St. Vincent is saying here is exactly what the Fifth Ecumenical Council ends up saying, that the only way to establish divine truth is in the context of an ecumenical council with unanimous judgment. So if Pinesap is going to contest this, he's going to have to say that St. Vincent is wrong, St. Theodosius before the council is wrong, St. Cyril is wrong, because they all say over and over and over again, the reason why it's authoritative is because it has the consent of all. This is really interesting at as far as what he said on Chalcedon. This is Pope Leo on the excommunication of Dioscorus. Therein, Leo refers to Dioscorus as the bishop of the city of Alexandria, but does not identify Eutyches by his clergyman title because he had been lawfully condemned by his own bishop. So because Dioscorus was not excommunicated by the ecumenical council, Leo still gives him his title of bishop of Alexandria, whereas he doesn't do the same for Eutyches because he was actually excommunicated by his own patriarch. And I think that's my time.
All right, thank you for that rebuttal, Luigi. All right, so gentlemen, we're going to get into the cross-examination segment. Each of you will get 10 minutes. For those that are not familiar with how that works, one side will get to ask questions. The other side will only be able to answer questions. The only questions you can ask would be a clarifier about the question. If you have a counter question, you need to wait until your cross-examination segment. We're going to start with Pinesap. You can interrupt, you can redirect, you can do whatever you want with this 10 minutes. Luigi, you can only answer questions. Pinesap, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
Yeah. So my first question would be when, Luigi refers to this idea of oneness, right? When Patriarch John II of Constantinople writes back to Hormisdas, I would like to ask him what he thinks of the following letter that Pope St. Hormisdas sent to Patriarch John II when he wrote him, quote, "As I consider the writings of your love, in which you profess to have one faith with that of the blessed apostle Peter, it seems permissible to exclaim in those prophetic words, behold, how good and how pleasant is it for brothers to dwell together in unity. For neither does it seem how great a distance divides us, when by God's handiwork we are joined in one common dwelling of faith. For now, the divine mercy has procured that once scattered members of Christ have come back together in the completeness of one body, and the inheritance of our Lord announced by the prophetic voices, having been laid waste by thieves, is now restored." Pay attention to this next line. "And truly, in the faith of this rock, that is, the firmness of the Prince of the Apostles, the Eastern Church's foundations are made solid. Since your letters have already indicated that has been done, it must be said with timely rejoicing, how beautiful are the feet of those who announce peace, of those who announce good tidings." So my question to Luigi would be, what do you make of that letter when Pope St. Hormisdas seems to explicitly affirm the Catholic view that the oneness that Patriarch John II writes about is oneness in being in communion?
It's very possible that that's what he wanted that to mean. The point is that that's not what neither the legate nor the Patriarch of Constantinople meant when it was signed. Otherwise, the legate wouldn't have apologized to the Pope and wouldn't have said that the Patriarch received it as a letter and not as a libellus.
It seems curious, though, because when the formula of Pope St. Hormisdas is kind of reread repeatedly through church history, it doesn't seem to delete the line that says the solidity of the Catholic faith is, in the apostolic see. How would you respond to that if it was kind of repeatedly brought up during different ecumenical councils? I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but different ecumenical councils or what have you.
Oh, that's just, my point with that is just to show that, because I've heard Roman Catholics say before that the term apostolic see, was only used for Rome. So I just wanted to refute that. That was my point with that.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Let me go to the next question. So it was claimed in your debate review with Dyer that your church could venerate popes who had erred in their view of power, since saints can err, which we would agree as Catholics, right, that saints can make errors. That's perfectly fine. However, this becomes
problematic. Did Dyer say that? Who said that? Sorry,
he did. Oh no, that's fine. He did during your debate review with VOR, or after the VOR debate. He had said that, I think, about Pope St. Leo, if I'm not mistaken.
That we can venerate popes that fell into error?
No. Saying like their view of ecclesiology you might view as wrong, but it doesn't create any problem for you because in your view,
that there were popes who had like a higher view than what they actually had. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Right. So sorry, I'll continue with the question. However, this becomes problematic when the popes have habitually taught that they had an authority to profess the truth of God to the entire church in a binding manner. If the Holy Spirit protected the early church, then how could the Bishop of Rome repeatedly make erroneous statements regarding his own authority when condemnations about his authority remain unheard of in the church of the first millennium?
So, I guess I would contest. I would need to see what examples you're referring. For example, I can show you Pope Gelasius is a common proof text. I can show you him saying that any bishop can excommunicate anyone, which is contra Roman Catholic canon law. So what specific case study would you be referring to? What pope would you be referring to? And what exactly do you see problematic about venerating them? Because you agree saints make mistakes, right?
Oh, of course. Saints do make mistakes.
Hang on real quick. I'm sorry, Luigi.
Sorry.
You need to be answering, not asking the question.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to that was more of a clarification. Sorry.
Fair. Yeah.
No, that's totally fine. What I would say is the proof texts that I would put forward are like Pope St. Innocent I. I would say Pope St. Agatho. I would say Hormisdas, as I've said earlier, Pope St. Leo, Gelasius, Zosimus, all these popes that seem to assert a power over the entire church.
Well, so Pope Zosimos, that was a local dispute with Carthage. So that doesn't have anything to do with universal authority. I mean, we'd have to go down the line with all of these. Pope Leo says I can show you quotes of Leo talking about the absolute necessity for consent. I mean, all of these popes, they might make some of these claims that sound very honorific and strong, kind of like my honorifics, but ultimately, almost every single one of the ones you listed, like, still holds to a view of absolute necessity for consent, which is polar opposite what Gasser says in Vatican I.
If the Greek fathers of Nicaea II felt it necessary to leave in the statement of the permanency of Rome's primacy in Adrian I's letter to St. Tarcisius, and this is remarked in Craig Trulia's book in a footnote, and this permanence is repeated in the Acts of Councils like Ephesus with Philip the Papal Legate, what does this mean for the Eastern Orthodox position of such a primacy when their own saints habitually refer to it?
Well, a couple things. First of all, we have Constantinople is New Rome, but I would also say that the language of a see never failing, again, I showed that's why that one quote from the Eighth Ecumenical Council, the Roman Catholic Eighth Ecumenical Council, is so important, because it says all five patriarchs. And then there's the quote of the emperor never failing. So I think that the fathers didn't foresee like something like the Great Schism ever happening. And so they just were saying none of these sees are ever going to fail. The emperor is never going to fail. I think that's a better explanation than special pleading and saying only these ones about the Pope are literal, but these other ones are just empty honorifics.
Gotcha. Zen, how much more time do I have?
You have a little under 4 minutes.
Okay, that's totally fine. Luigi, what do you think of the Synod of Whitby, which cited Matthew 16:18 as the precedent for celebrating Easter the way Rome had, over and above the calculation used by St. Columba?
Was this during the what controversy was this? What time period are we talking about?
I think this would have been during the 600s, if I'm not mistaken. And
it quotes Matthew 16.
Yes.
To say what?
To celebrate Easter according to the custom of Rome, over and above that which was according to the custom, meaning the calculation of the date, over and above St. Columba's calculation.
I mean, it's pretty clear from Eusebius's recollection of when this was actually established that it was all by virtue of a synod. And this sounds like a local council in the West, or what is this council that you're referencing?
It would be a local council in the West.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so this is actually really interesting. There are so many local councils in the West, which you don't really see in the East, which is why you guys have a much different view on canon law than we do in the East. So you're going to find, I can show you all kinds of councils in the West, local councils that say stuff you don't agree with. One being Carthage, so I would say that even if I were to grant that local council doesn't carry a lot of weight.
Zen, how much time do I have?
About 2.5 minutes.
Okay. One of my final questions would be, all the evidence I presented to you, that I presented to you, you say is empty honorifics. So what do I need to present or read from the fathers and the councils to prove the papacy?
No, I'm not saying it's empty honorifics. I mean, as I laid out in my initial debate with Voice of Reason, like, we have a high view of like what Rome, like the role Rome had in the first millennium. And I'll read a quote in my closing statement. And what we see from documents like Dictatus Papae is it's very evident that like that model from the first millennium was strayed very, very quickly, like after 1054. And, even something as simple as like the pseudo-Isidorian forgeries, which were extremely influential in the centuries leading up to the schism. So to be honest, you'd be pretty hard pressed to find evidence, because there's so many other honorifics, and because we have such blatant evidence of immediately after the schism of Rome clearly straying from the first millennium tradition. It'd be very hard to prove the Vatican I papacy. I think it's which is why you have a lot of apologetics now that talk about like the development and how it was a seed form and grew into fruition.
And so, what time am I at?
About 1 minute.
I'll give the time over to Luigi. We can pass on to Luigi's questions.
Okay, no problem. All right, and Luigi, whenever you're ready, you have 10 minutes on the clock for your cross exam.
Just 1 second.
Got it.
Okay, I'm ready. All right. So, Pinesap, you brought up the 3 chapters. So the letter to Maurice has nothing to do with the 3 chapters. So Vigilius specifically defends the letter to Maurice. And I read the quotes. I can read them again. He defends the contents. He says this is page 201 of Price. For it is right for us to understand correctly that in this way a document that our fathers accepted, page 199, from the reading of the text of the letter produced by his adversary, his writing has been shown to be Catholic. So he defends the contents of this letter, which he then retracts in the second constitutum. So that is a matter of faith and morals. That's not a matter of fact.
I think what I would say on that is, considering how, the initial controversy with Vigilius, right, was seen as a problem of sort of renouncing Chalcedon. I mean, that's why you have like the schism at Aquila. You have like the schism with like the African churches and stuff like that. They had thought that the Second Council of Constantinople was like renouncing Chalcedon, right?
Oh, I agree. No, I agree. I mentioned this. He's under the impression that Chalcedon accepted Ibas's letter to Maurice. He corrects this in his second constitutum. But the problem is he attempts to bind the church to this letter under that erroneous presupposition. So that is a matter of faith and morals that he attempts to bind the church to.
Is the binding that you're speaking of when he says like anyone who does not accept this is excommunicated?
Well, there's that. And then there's the quote that I read. He also says that. He says, if you don't accept this, you're excommunicated from the Apostolic See. That's on page 171. But I read where he says, by the authority of the Apostolic See, let no one call this into question, basically.
I would have to reread the Father Price's section on that. I have it up here, but it's not really in a condensable format for me to read out quick. But what I would say, I mean, specifically referring to the condemnation or the like excommunication of disciplinary decrees, we have many examples in church history post-schism where someone was like wrongfully excommunicated, or there was a disciplinary measure in terms of an excommunication that didn't necessarily imply any sort of papal infallibility. In fact, one that I can remember off the top of my head actually happened under Blessed Pius IX, in which there was actually a Brazilian bishop who was an extremely holy man of God. I believe he's a blessed or a saint in the church. And he was wrongfully excommunicated because he was dealing with a political issue in Brazil. I think in a contention with Freemasons. So an excommunication or a disciplinary decree in that way can be undone.
I'm not talking about the excommunication, though. That I don't mean to be disrespectful. I feel like this is a little bit of a filibuster because I'm not talking about the excommunication. I'm talking about Vigilius asserting his authority as the Apostolic See and attempting to bind the church to a letter that he later deemed to be heretical. That's what I'm talking about. That's faith and morals. That's not facts.
That I would have to read a little bit more on specifically. So I'd like to pass on to a next question. I'm sure there's a sufficient answer to it. I just don't have it easily accessible in my notes here.
I'm assuming you agree with the Catholic Catechism when it says that the Pope has universal power over the whole church, a power which he can always exercise unhindered.
Yes. Okay,
so you agree that the Pope can appoint a patriarch, right?
I do.
Okay. Can you explain to me why Pope Martin then says, he says, Stephen of Dora, was ordered to ordain bishops and priests and deacons according to the canons, as far as power was lacking to us to appoint the Patriarch of Jerusalem.
So there's two things to there. Keep going.
Go ahead.
So there's two things to keep in mind in the context in which he's writing. For one, that's when Muslim incursions were starting to happen in that region of the world. And so there was a physical difficulty in having the power to elect a new patriarch. On top of that, too, the normative means of electing a patriarch was through a synod, right? Because at the time, they wanted someone who could represent that region of the church. And so they didn't have, really, because of the Muslim incursion and the horrible events going on at that time, the power to gather a synod, which was generally the normative means of electing the new patriarch, in order to appoint that patriarch.
Okay, so two things. So first of all, Stephen of Dora was physically there in Palestine the same year. So it wasn't a matter of him not being able to get there. He was able to get there the same year.
No. I didn't say that he was not able to get there. I know he was there.
And then in the 1200s, the Pope had no problem appointing a patriarch of Alexandria without a council. So do you think a council is required to appoint a patriarch?
No. What I'm saying about
then why are you using that as a justification?
What I'm saying about the synod? Hold on. What I'm saying about the synod is respecting a church's local custom is different than not having the power to do something. I'm saying that Pope St. Martin respected the local custom of using a synod to appoint a bishop,
But he
which was
said
actually
power
very
was
prominent in the East as well, or the West as well.
But he specifically uses the verbiage, the power was lacking to appoint the patriarch. He doesn't say he's respecting the traditions. He says the power was lacking to appoint the patriarch.
But given the context, the power might refer to the human, or is likely referring to the human event going on that prevents the normative means of how they would appoint that patriarch, which
What
again,
normative
the custom
means
that Pope
if
St.
the Pope
Martin
can do it,
respects.
if the Pope can do it without a council, what are the normative means? He should just be able to appoint the patriarch.
The normative means
This is clear evidence that the ecclesiology was different in the first
the
millennium.
normative means refers to the idea that they want a patriarch who can represent the people, right? This is why you had synods that would like elect a patriarch, right? Because they didn't want to necessarily just appoint someone who the people felt at variance with or whatever in order to create discord.
But that's not what he says.
This is what I'm referring to with like the church being both divine and human, right? You work with human means to try and appoint the best possible situation. Power doesn't necessarily mean that he was lacking to do so.
But I mean, that's what he says verbatim. I'll let the audience decide. Do you must be in communion with Rome to be a Catholic church?
Say that one more time.
Do you have to be in communion with Rome to be a Catholic church?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Do you agree that the entire church was in communion with Flavian from 394 to 399, except for Rome?
So let me go to my section on the Meletian schism. So there's kind of a couple.
Specifically, I just want to, before you put that up, I want to point out, I'm talking about Flavian, not Meletius. I'm talking about Flavian from the years of 394 to 399, when the entire church was in communion with him and Rome was not. And then Theodoret says the Western bishops promised to finally bring their hostility to a close in 399. That's what I'm talking about. Not
well, having a certain hostility, right, with the Meletian schism and what have you, that had kind of led to the events with Flavian, doesn't necessarily mean that he was a like full avowed schismatic, right? Having just a mere disciplinary problem doesn't mean that a person is not a part of the Catholic Church. Like I said, you can point to local bishops, right, excommunicating a saint. I'm trying to think of the Australian saint, for instance, who she was excommunicated by her local bishop, but it was like a wrongful excommunication. So having a sort of lapse in like the situation of a given figure in the church, especially with how like letters would travel at that time, doesn't necessarily mean that they were condemned by Rome or fully, excommunicated from the Catholic Church.
Well, I'm not saying they were condemned by Rome, but they were not in communion with Rome, because in 394, a conciliar decree of Constantinople had the signatures of all the other patriarchs that Flavian was the true patriarch of Antioch, not Rome's. Rome finally enters into communion in 399. So for 5 years, he was not in communion. He was in communion with the entire rest of the church, but not Rome.
But again, that issue is just a matter of, again, letters traveling. It doesn't necessarily mean what I'm saying is that he was not necessarily like thrown out of the Church of God just because the letters had to travel or what have you. Like it's kind of like if you were reconciled with your local bishop and then, letters were sent out to Rome that you were like all good and you were no longer in schism or what have you. Like if Hans Kung, for instance, rather than dying in heresy, had actually reconciled with the German bishops conference or whatever bishops conference he was under, and letters were then sent to Rome, like let's say a month later, a year later, saying, "Hey, he's been reconciled," right?
Okay, I have another question here. So, do you argue that does Rome get its supreme authority over the church from Peter because it's Petrine?
Say that one more time.
Does Rome get its supreme authority over the universal church because it's Petrine?
Yes.
Okay. Can you give me a justification for why Antioch is never considered the second see in any canons?
Well, it's not considered the second see because Constantinople was seen as the new Rome, right? It was seen as the sort of.
It's not even considered It's not even considered the third see. Alexandria, no. Antioch is universally considered more Petrine than Alexandria. This is the patristic consensus. So we should expect that if Rome's supremacy comes from being Petrine, that Antioch should always be considered to be right below Rome.
The apostolic see, though, was set, or apostolic see singular, not plural here, because it can be used for many sees, was set up at Rome in order to preside over the other churches. So it's not a mere matter of Peter established the church here, right? But it's, did Peter establish the church in a manner that it was meant to preside over the others? And that's what we see with Rome, right? So that's why Alexandria is Petrine, because, St. Mark the Evangelist helped set it up with sending out from Peter. And Antioch, of course, Peter had spent many years there and helped establish the church there. But Rome is given this specific jurisdiction or privilege over the entire church of God because Peter meant to instill that church specifically with that Petrine principle.
And that'll be time for the cross-examination.
Gotcha.
Gentlemen, we are going to go into an open dialogue segment. Before we do that, I want to remind the chat, if you guys want to call in and ask a question directly to either debater, after the closing statements, you can get a link from the mods in the Discord. The Discord link should be in the live chat somewhere. Go in there, get a stream link from the mods in the Discord. You can call in and ask a question directly to either debater on stream. But we are going to get into an open dialogue segment, so it's similar to what the channel has traditionally done here. So we'll just have open dialogue, about 30 minutes back and forth. You're each welcome to take the conversation, frame it wherever you want, but be charitable, be respectful to each other. I'll only step in if it's just so much over talking that we can't understand either of you, or if it just trails off somewhere irrelevant. But gentlemen, whenever you're ready, the floor is open.
I want to clarify something. So you said in your rebuttal that I was trying to make the argument that Constantinople I had didn't have the consent of Rome or something like that. That's not what I was saying. They did have a papal legate, and I brought that up. Saint Scholias of Thessalonica was considered the papal legate. My point was that a universal decree was made that was binding upon the whole church, and the Pope had very little to do with it. Whereas that would be unheard of in a second millennium ecclesiology. That was the point I was trying to make.
Okay, there might have been some miscommunication there. I don't remember exactly. I'm now just forgetting what you literally just said. I apologize. I'm trying to keep.
I'm just talking about the Theodosian. I'm just talking about the Theodosian code, and how you had said in your rebuttal, you were like, "Oh, he's trying to argue that it was binding upon the whole church without Rome." I wasn't saying that. I was saying that there was a papal legate, but it was very little involvement compared to what you would expect from a supreme, immediate, head of the church. That's what I was.
Gotcha. I can get into that in my closing statement. Thank you for clarifying, though. I think there was just some miscommunication there.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you not agree that a universally binding decree that had little papal involvement, is that not unheard of in the second millennium? Is that something you'd ever dream of happening today in the Roman Catholic Church?
No, well, the thing about Constantinople I is it's as I stated before, right, in the kind of ex cathedra and via ecumenical councils opening that I had. With ecumenical councils, the Pope can approve of a council after the fact, right? And, Constantinople...
No, I agree with that.
Right.
Yeah.
And so with that, I mean, that's why, for instance, even with Vigilius, in the case of Vigilius, they sought specifically after Vigilius's confirmation the most. Because if you look at Justinian, right, he had no problem exiting this bishop or that patriarch that disagreed with him on the Second Council of Constantinople. And he very much could have done the same with Rome. Now, I know you probably will remark there, oh, he excommunicated him, but that didn't make it into the final acts. And it certainly wasn't a conciliar action, considering how the Council Fathers still insisted that they did not break communion with Rome specifically, even though they intended, per the urgings of Justinian, to excommunicate Pope Vigilius. But of course, that didn't make it in the final session. That was confirmed by Vigilius. And then when he confirmed the council, he issued the council in his own name. And you can see John the Miaphysite actually complain about that. But Price's commentary.
But their verbiage there was in reference to the Roman Synod, right? And not the person of the Pope, which is really significant because we see in Constantinople 869 when 1,000 bishops, including the Roman Synod, depose Pope Nicholas, right? And so we see there's something about the Roman Synod itself and not the person of the Pope that was seen as special to the church. Do you disagree with that?
I would contest your characterization of the Roman Synod, because the words there is apostolic see. It's not just Roman Synod, right? So they were able to make this distinction between the seat holder and the see.
But they're
clearly
not
see that in breaking of communion with other apostolic sees that can just be broken with communion for X amount of years and then eventually
but they're
reconcile
clearly
with
not
the
referring to
church.
the person of the Pope because they just called him not a Christian. So they have to be called. They must be referring to something other than the person of the Pope when they're saying Apostolic See. Otherwise, they wouldn't be saying immediately right after that his name is foreign to that of Christians.
Yes, the seat of Rome. That's what I'm saying, right?
That's
They still
what I'm
saw
saying.
it as necessary preserving the communion with the seat of Rome. And again, you don't really see that with other apostolic sees. I mean, other apostolic sees, right? They can, break communion with them, and it's not seen as a necessary constitutive part of the church. I mean, this is what we see, for instance, with like the Pentarchy, right? Like Saint Stephen the Younger, Saint Nicephorus and Saint Theodore the Studite think that the Pentarchy is completely important, right? But in that, they still have a monarchical view of specifically the Roman See, which they, contest. Can't, without Rome, it can't confirm any of sort of the conciliar actions even taken upon by the other four patriarchs. I mean, Saint Nicephorus is completely explicit about this.
I'm gonna just move on.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
And
Are we getting into callers?
You can jump in at any point too. We're doing open dialogue right
It's
now.
just open dialogue right now.
Yeah.
You guys can.
All right,
So
I
Pinesap,
totally misheard.
you can take the conversation wherever you want. You can, ask whatever questions you want to Luigi. There's not really a restriction on this, so you guys can go wherever you want with it.
Yeah, so I did actually have a question for Luigi that was very interesting. Was the quote that you were referring to with the Eighth Ecumenical Council that of Banes?
Let me pull up my citation for that.
Where it was like, referring to the Pentarchy and stuff like that?
The five C's.
Yeah. Is that from him?
It is. You can make your point, and I'll tell you when I pull up I got 7 million words here. So
the very interesting thing about him is he says that during the Eighth Ecumenical Council, but he's there during all the sessions which kind of approve the letters of the Pope talking about this perpetuity of specifically the Roman See, right? So even when he's making sort of this statement that's kind of like the absolute equality of the entire Pentarchy, it's very interesting how when we, listen to the retelling of the Acts by Price, we don't see him contesting when Rome is given a specific sort of prerogative of perpetuity that's, as I kind of said earlier in the debate, referenced by, say, Philip the Papal Legate, Pope St. Leo, and, Pope Hadrian, I think it was Pope Hadrian the First at Nicaea too, right? In his letter to St. Tarcisius, which Craig, again, leaves in his book, but then he just kind of writes it off as like honorific words.
Well, so first of all, this council had 12 bishops. When 2 years prior, they were able to get 1,000 bishops to depose the Pope. But also this council in Canon 1, and I can read the whole canon, but the canon states that when a determination is made by Constantinople, that's final in the East. And that when a determination is made by Rome, that's final in the West. And that both sees are to basically respect those decisions. That is not something that is compatible with, you guys don't even have a see that's even remotely close to having that type of authority in the current modern Roman Catholic Church, where they would have a matching authority to Rome's.
But what I would contest about that is when we see in the Council 879, which we would refer to as the Phodian Council, we actually see it brought up during the Council Acts that it's primarily the Pope's prerogative to bind and loose, and that's why he could bind and loose the prior anathemas and what have you against Photius. It's given that specific Petrine principle to the Pope to bind and loose the prior council that had happened in the anathemas or the deposition of Photius, right? And in a specific prerogative referred to as the prerogative that Rome holds. In fact, that's kind of why the Gregorian reformers brought up actually the Council of 879, specifically the Phodian Council, so much during the Gregorian reform as a precedent for St. Gregory VII's binding and loosing authority, because they saw it as a strong affirmation of the Petrine principle.
Well, I would need to hear the actual quotation, because what I find interesting is, first of all, St. Photius is called all kinds of honorific stuff at that council. He's called
he is, yeah.
He's called the most holy master and ecumenical patriarch, one true shepherd. But this is really interesting, especially on the topic of what you just said, because Pope Gregory II, when he's writing to the Emperor Leo III, he says that both Constantinople and Rome have received power from above to loose and to bind things in heaven and on earth. And so what we see during this controversy is actually like that both Constantinople and Rome have that authority. And I would argue that St. Photius was never rightfully deposed because it never had the consent of the church. So we don't need the Pope to determine that. And do you guys accept that that St. Photius was the rightful patriarch?
We don't accept that he was the rightful patriarch when St. Ignatius was deposed, but once that whole controversy had blown over, he then did become the rightful patriarch.
So you would say he was the patriarch, and then he wasn't for 10 years, and then he went back to becoming the rightful patriarch.
Well, remember, St. Ignatius writes an appeal to Rome to settle the issue with Photius, right? Because that's one of his whole things. He's like, I've been unjustly deposed, right? Photius has taken my seat. And so now you need to hold this council in order to deal with the whole issue regarding Photius, right? And that's where you get the council of, I believe, 869, if I'm not mistaken. Then after that, kind of the issue is quelled. There's communion reestablished between Photius and Rome, right? Under, I believe, John VIII, if I'm not mistaken. And at that point, Photius is accepted as the Patriarch of Constantinople by the West.
I'm just curious, what is your response to Constantinople 867, where over 1,000 bishops deposed the Pope? The Pope ends up dying, so he never gets word. But it had the full consent of every patriarch, including the Roman Synod, to depose Pope Nicholas.
I would have to see the evidence for that and read upon that specific instance, admittedly more. Okay. What I would say is that not every deposition or what have you is automatically valid just because a lot of bishops attend it. For instance, now you might contest because this wasn't attended by a bunch of patriarchs, but in fact, ironically, when the Council of Florence was going on, it's always referred to as Basil Ferrara Florence for a distinct reason, because the Council of Basil met together, right, and started issuing sort of like conciliarist sounding decrees. And so when Pope Eugene IV had kind of a problem with that, he said, okay, I shut down this council and I'm moving it to Florence instead, to which the council fathers at that time said, okay, well, we say you're deposed and we oppose this, or we prop up this anti-pope. So just because there's maybe a synod or a council that says the Pope is deposed, I don't necessarily automatically think that that is a deposition that is valid, right? And again, I would go back to our monarchical view that I think is in line with the early church fathers of the Pentarchy, which St. Robert Bellarmine, in his work on the councils, says that the Pentarchy does belong to the health of the church, but given that, again, like Ephesus II and Ephesus I didn't have the consent of all the patriarchs of Christendom, it's not a necessary constituent for whether a council is validly ecumenical or not.
Okay, I want to respond to that in a second. First of all, the reference is Acts of Constantinople 869, page 87 is where he says, it's where he says 1,000 signatures were gathered to depose Pope Nicholas, including all the patriarchs. I want to respond to your I didn't get a chance to get to this reception theory. So wouldn't you agree that even though it took time for Hebrews and Revelation to be considered scripture, that the moment it was penned as scripture, it was scripture?
Say that one more time.
So wouldn't you agree that just because it took time for the church to receive Revelation and Hebrews, that they were still scripture the moment they were penned?
Yes, I would.
That's the full concept of reception theory. That just because it wasn't immediately recognized doesn't take away that it was ecumenical.
But I think where we would disagree is where is the epistemological certainty in that? Because, for instance, and this is what Bishop Callistus Ware brings up, I forget in which address to which college, but he talks about in the Orthodox view what is considered an ecumenical council or not, and he refers to all these different like false synods, right, that happen. In fact, one of which I wanted to refer to you because you mentioned, the four patriarchs consenting to something. You have like the Synod of Oaks, for instance, that, condemned St. John Chrysostom. And the only one person who spoke up for St. John Chrysostom was actually the Bishop of Rome. All four patriarchs were represented at that synod and declared that St. John Chrysostom was condemned. So if all the four patriarchs are there and they condemn him, does that then automatically mean that his condemnation was valid just because most of the Pentarchy was represented?
Well, not It wasn't received by the whole church, though. It wasn't received by every one of the patriarchs. And I would also just ask on the epistemic certainty thing. I think you could say the same for example, when Pope Liberius signs an Arian confession, and Jerome says Pope Liberius, conquered by the tedium of exile and subscribing to heretical wickedness, entered Rome. That's Jerome saying that. We all know Jerome has a very high view of the Pope. So I think if you pick out like a given moment in time and you say like, where is the epistemic certainty? That's not going to work well for you, me, or the Protestant. So we have to look at like the paradigm as a whole, because you're going to be in the same position during this period of time, or even like during the time of Vigilius before he wrote his second Constitutum. So I would just say that you don't really offer a solution to that.
Well, what I would say to kind of contest that is, when you have a period of time where it's sort of patriarch against patriarch, it's this patriarch doesn't consent to that, these two patriarchs don't consent to that council, these three do. It sort of demands that every lay person suddenly becomes or is needing to become a theologian, because they're not really necessarily able to even trust their local bishop. I mean, you have like councils, again, like false councils, like Seleucia, or the other Arian synod that was attended by way more bishops, right, than any sort of ecumenical council that went on. And by all intensive accounts, that would seem like it had a greater reception than even these smaller ecumenical councils that proclaim the true faith. It seems that the only consistent theme that we see in church history, even with the events kind of leading around Vigilius, as I stated earlier, where his approval is still very much sought after, it seems like confirmation by the Bishop of Rome is kind of the only consistent theme. Otherwise, we're kind of ping-ponging and trying to figure out, like, does a council only become ecumenical like 100 years after it's called? I mean, most certainly, I would agree. We don't want to jump to like easy conclusions as Catholics and say like, oh, because we're not given the full information about, say, Saint Liberius or what have you, that therefore means we can hold like an epistemic principle over and above Orthodox or Protestants. But I'm referring more to, it seems like there's this long platitude of time in the Orthodox view where we're not really sure whether a council is ecumenical or not. Sorry, that was a lot, but
you could say the same thing about Hebrews and Revelation taking so much time to be received. I mean, Rome didn't even consider Revelation to be scripture until Athanasius went to Rome to convince the Pope. So, I mean, you could say the same thing. I would say you guys have reception theory when it comes to recognizing scripture and even recognizing councils, because in the Pope accepted Constantinople 879. It wasn't until the Gregorian Reform that was backtracked and Constantinople 869 was accepted. So that's reception theory right there in your own paradigm.
What I would contest, though, with that is I'm pretty sure Pope John VIII, or the reigning pope at that time, had only accepted that Photius was then made the legitimate patriarch of Constantinople. I wouldn't say that he accepted, because I believe in his letter confirming the council, he puts kind of a qualifier on there, and I'd have to bring it up again, where he talks about how he confirms the fact that Photius is the instated patriarch of Constantinople. So that's what I would say in response to that. Sorry, I'm kind of losing my train of thought because we're going back and forth on kind of a lot of different details.
You want to switch gears? I just kind of want to get your thoughts on these quotes about Jerusalem, like they're like Justin the Emperor, and then more specifically Saint Augustine, saying that
absolutely.
Saying that like the communion with Jerusalem is necessary to be a Catholic church. What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on that are, it would be similar to in the church actually nowadays, that if I was not in communion with my local bishop, I would not be in communion with the Catholic Church. For instance, I'll give you an example. Archbishop Aquila of Denver, right? He's the Archbishop of my region and what have you, has said that when you go to an SSPX chapel, you're not maintaining communion with him, right? Even if they might, have him in the commemoration in the liturgy, right? The East would know this as the diptychs. It's a matter of being united in faith and heart to the local bishop that places you in communion with the Church Universal. And that's the same way we would view those words about, was that the Patriarch of Jerusalem?
Yes, it was St. Augustine was talking about Jerusalem.
Yes, we would view it the exact same way, right? Because it's not simply that it's just the Pope and then all other bishops are eliminated from there. In fact, are eliminated from the divine hierarchy of the church. In fact, this is completely contested against after Vatican I by not only Blessed Pius IX, but also Leo the 13th. Leo the 13th in like Satis Cognitum says, the bishops of the church are truly bishops. They're not merely just like Peter's servants, or sort of during the controversy with like St. Gregory the Great and John the Faster, like just merely like extensions of the Pope, but not being real bishops within themselves. It's like they're real and truly bishops. And so that would be kind of, and similarly, the German episcopate issued a round letter about how, the Vatican I definition did not do away with the episcopate. And Blessed Pius IX actually writes to them and says, not only do, I tolerate this definition, this is a perfect enunciation of the council. So we do not eliminate the local church by any means. And so to be in communion with the local hierarch of the church is most certainly a necessary constituent of being in communion with the church universal. So that's why the catechism defines schism as like, it's not just about being in communion with the Bishop of Rome, but like all your other Catholics around you.
So I would just say a couple things. So first of all, we have a pretty well-established patristics that say that there's something unique about Jerusalem because, as the mother of all churches, which Rome claims that title, even though Constantinople I gave that title to Jerusalem. But like St. Augustine's justification, right, is this. He says, Christ made there the beginning of the preaching of his name, and you shrink back with horror from having communion with that city. St. Clement even says that the Bishop of Jerusalem is the Bishop of bishops. And then Avitus says that they have a primacy. As I said, Justin, the emperor, says that communion with them is absolutely necessary and no one would dare break communion with them. So it seems to be more than just like communion with your local church. But I would also say that everything you just said, I don't see why that can't be applied to the quotes by like Jerome that talk about the necessity of communion with Rome. It just seems like special pleading.
I don't think it's special pleading in the slightest, because again, it goes back to what I said about honorifics. Why are honorifics used? Honorifics denote a certain theological conclusion that we reach by, understanding the full context of what's being written. Why is Jerusalem called the mother of all churches? In fact, I believe it was St. John Paul II who, in an ecumenical gathering, addressed the Patriarch of Jerusalem as, being a part of the mother of all church, or the mother of all churches, or hailing from the mother of all churches. And the reason why he says that is because the church, of course, started in Jerusalem. That was, where all the events starting and establishing the church had gone on. But Rome has this motherhood in a sense of being, having this jurisdictional power over the entire church, given the context of the early patristic evidence we have. Certainly, Jerusalem can be referred to as a mother, and is, even after the schism, in a sense of, again, being where the church had originally started, right? And so as a mother to her sons, all the other sees are established. But Rome is a mother in the sense that she is established to preside over the church universal. So there's a distinction there made.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that's kind of begging the question of what the debate is about. Because like you're saying, it's because they have this, jurisdictional universal power over the whole church. Well, that's what we're debating. So I think that's kind of begging the question in order to answer the special pleading.
I don't think necessarily, because again, if I simply just read a letter and it says Father of Fathers or head of the church or what have you, I'm reading that in a manner. If I'm reading how you're reading, I'm just saying, well, if anyone else is called the head, no one can be the head. If anyone's called the key bearer, everyone has to be the key bearer. But there's always these distinctions made, right? I mean, why does St. Leo the First, for instance, in his sermon say that even though like all the apostles have equal honor, Peter in that apostolic college is established as sort of being the preeminent amongst them? And this is backed up by even post-schism saints like St. Bernard of Clairvaux that say there are many doorkeepers, there are many key bearers, but you are the preeminent amongst them, in his On Consideration to, I think, Pope Eugene III.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple things. First of all, I mean, we agree that Peter was the chief apostle. I mean, nobody disputes that. I think I can point you to multiple quotes by St. Leo that, point to the requirement for consent. He also calls the emperor, he says the emperor can't err. So, I mean, again, I think a lot of these quotes just end up being special pleading. As far as like jurisdictional, stuff, I mean, I actually have two examples here of one of them is Ambrose of all saints, who appeals to Constantinople despite being in a Roman jurisdiction, and then the same for the Bishop of Patras. I have two examples of that, and so like if those are the type of like justifications that you guys give as like why Rome has this like universal immediate authority. But then we see the same thing with Constantinople. We see the same thing with the emperor. If anything, the emperor is the one who ends most of these schisms. Even with the popular formula for mistos, I can show you where the history books say Justin was the one who forced all the bishops to finally sign a version of it.
There's a problem with that there. It's the difference between having material and formal power, right? So the Pope can most certainly, this is, again, goes back to what I said about status cognitum, right? The Pope can bind the church to something, but whether or not it is, completely sort of that binding is carried out would have to be on the part of the emperor, because, the Pope wields the spiritual authority over the entire church, and the emperor would wield the temporal authority over the entire church. In fact, you should understand this. This is the concept of symphonia in the East, right? The sort of harmony that exists between church and state. Pope St. Leo didn't have, yeah, I mean, you could be one pope, but like these popes didn't necessarily have like an army just at will that they could go issue and say, hey, go talk to this bishop, and if he's not going to comply, take him down. They would have to go with the authority at the time that had the ability to do that, right? And that's using the human means to issue a universal binding declaration or act.
But that's not the justification they give. I mean, like I said with Pope Agatho, I mean, he references the emperor as being divinely appointed. He applies Matthew 16 to him. I also would like to point out that Gregory,
in the city of Zion verse, in the city of Zion, like acclamation.
Yeah.
Well, what I would say, but remember,
he says
acclamation, he says you take on the invincible strength of the faith, right? And I mean, this is very common with like Ubi Petrus and stuff like that, but you guys also like to bring up the whole suggestio, like kind of line and stuff like that during that council.
I don't want to get too far. I don't want to get too far past I want to read this quote on the topic of material power.
Hold up one moment, because you have been talking quite a bit. I need to get some.
Yeah, we got about 4 minutes left here. So yeah, Pinesap, go ahead and finish your point. Luigi,
so I mean, this is like Agatho's suggestion to the Sixth Ecumenical Council. He says, "But those who do not wish to make this profession of faith with us, we judge them as enemies of the Catholic and Apostolic profession of faith, to be liable to eternal condemnation. Nor would we receive them ever in the college of our lowliness, unless they have amended. Nor should any of them suppose that we have transgressed against what we have received from those who have gone before us." I mean, even Father George Flavorsky, right? I'm probably butchering his last name, I apologize. I'm not great at Greek. But I mean, he even admitted that the document that Pope St. Agatho sends to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, he saw as an infallible document. This is, one of your most august theologians conceding to us that he saw his document as, completely infallible. And what do the Council Fathers do? They completely accept it.
Well, if it's infallible, then that means that the Orthodox empire of the emperor will never fail, because that's what it says.
No, so but what I've kept saying about that, remember, in that same acclamation, he says you put on the strength of the invincible faith. So the Orthodox Empire will never have the gates of hell prevail, precisely because they hold the true faith. It's not just because they're the empire alone. And likewise, hold on one moment. If you were to use that line to invalidate the infallibility of the Pope, you would also likely have to be consistent in that and invalidate in that same ecumenical council the indefectibility of the church, because the church is talked about as giving those same divine provinces. Otherwise, you're just doing, as you said earlier, special pleading as to what is truly our doctrine and what is not.
Well, I don't even have to dispute whether or not this is ex cathedra. I think I can actually, ex cathedra can be anyone that's speaking like an Orthodox doctrine. Something that is true is ex cathedra. So even if this letter were to be ex cathedra, that's kind of irrelevant. Because
but how is it irrelevant?
Well, so even like the Cappadocians' writings are called theanostas. I mean, Saint Cyril's writings are called similar things. So
Sure.
like when a document is orthodox, of course it's ex cathedra. Ex cathedra means that it's free from error.
But the
So-
document, but here's my whole issue. The document that you're calling orthodox refers specifically to the apostolic see being indefectible and possessing a certain level of infallibility. And if you don't believe me, like the spiritual mother that's referred to in the document, as you can see when it's talking about, I believe it's subdeacon Constantine, the apostolic see, meaning Rome, is referred to as the spiritual mother in their reference to Constantine the subdeacon during that council.
Okay,
So the spiritual mother isn't even the entire church. It's seen primarily as the apostolic see. So if you're calling that argument, or if you're calling that document orthodox, that would still be conceding my position, because you would say what Pope St. Agatha wrote on the indefectibility and infallibility of the apostolic see, Rome, singular in this sense, was orthodox, and so therefore the Catholic position still wins out.
You know, we have like 30 seconds.
Luigi, go ahead and make your response, your final point on this, and then we'll go to closers.
Yeah, we have to receive the letter as the council received it, and this is the same council that condemns Honorius for a doctrinal error. So it can't be the case that they meant Vatican I indefectibility if in the same council they condemn a pope for teaching error to the church, a doctrinal error, which, by the way, I believe a total of 6 councils, which Eric Ibarra grants, 6 different councils say this, and 3 of which are ecumenical, one of which is Constantinople 869, and it specifically points out the doctrines that Pope Honorius taught to the church. So we have to read these statements about indefectibility in the context of when they were received and how they were received.
All right, that'll do it for the open dialogue, gentlemen. Thank you. It was a very entertaining debate. We are going to move into closing statements. Pinesap, since you went first, we're going to give you the last word. So, Luigi, you'll go first on your closing statement, and then we'll get into Q&A. Luigi,
I'll go
whenever
first.
you're
My
ready.
closing statement, you said?
Yeah, yep, and then Pinesap will
Give
get
me
the
a
last
moment
word.
here. Let me get settled.
Okay.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
I don't have a lot. I'm just going to – can I start whenever?
Yep, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hang on. Let me start my timer. Okay. I just want to read. So Apostolic Canon 34. So this is like, these are some of the most important canons for understanding the history of the church. It states, the bishops of every nation must acknowledge him who is first among them and account him as their head, and do nothing of consequence without his consent. But each may do those things which only concern his own parish and the country places which belong to it. But neither let him who is first do anything without the consent of all. For so there will be unanimity, and God will be glorified through the Lord in the Holy Spirit. Throughout the first millennium, we see a requirement for consent as the underlying paradigm. Every single ecumenical council cites it as a requirement. Yet Vatican I, in Gasser's official interpretation of Pastor Eternos, states, quote, if these words of Christ are to have their necessary force, then it seems to me that one should conclude that the brothers, that is, the bishops, in order that they be firm in the faith, need the aid and advice of Peter and his successors, not vice versa, end quote. And again, quote, it can in no way be deduced that there is a strict and absolute necessity of seeking that consent from the church or from the bishops, end quote. Gregory VII, during the Council of Rome in 1080, even had the nerve to declare that, quote, we desire to show the world that we can give or take away at our will kingdoms, duchies, earldoms, in a word, the possessions of all men, for we can bind and loose, end quote. This is nothing short of insanity when contrasted with the church of the first millennium, and shows that it was not long after this schism that they innovated a brand new ecclesiology. I have some time here. I'm going to pull up a quote by St. Theodore the Studite. Actually, I'm going to yield the rest of my time. I'm good on closing.
You still have 3 minutes if you.
All right, let me just pull up the quote. I just want to pull up the quote real quick. This is what we see as the actual ecclesiology of the first millennium. But here it is a question of divine and heavenly decisions, and these are reserved only to him. The word of God has said, whatsoever you shall bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And who are the men to whom this order was given? the apostles and their successors. And who are their successors? He who occupies the throne of Rome and is the first, the one who sits upon the throne of Constantinople and is the second. After them, those of Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. That is the Pentarchic authority in the church, and it is to them that all decision belongs in divine dogmas. So we see from St. Theodore, as well from the apostolic canons and throughout church history and every single ecumenical council, the unanimous consent of all is what is required for divine dogmas. We just see the same thing in St. Vincent. This is the consistent pattern in the first millennium church. And we see immediately after the schism, when popes are saying that they have, at their very word, the ability to take the possessions of all men single-handedly. Single-handedly. That's what they're claiming in the Council of Rome in 1080. I yield the rest of my time.
All right, thank you for your closer there, Luigi. And Pinesap, whenever you're ready, you have 5 minutes on the clock for your closing statement.
You got it. I'm ready. Throughout this debate, Luigi has, under scrutiny, not been able to demonstrate a consistent metric by which to determine what councils are definitive or not. I don't believe that he sufficiently refuted Pope St. Hormisdas, even after I put forward the quote of Pope St. Hormisdas writing to to John II of Constantinople, affirming the Catholic view that the oneness of their sees was rather holding communion, and that Patriarch John II of Constantinople held communion with Hormisdas, the Apostolic See, right? He didn't refute Pope St. Agatho's letter at the Sixth Ecumenical Council. And when he brought up the case of Honorius, it's very interesting that Cardinal Newman granted that even if Honorius was declared a heretic, the capacity in which he wrote was not an ex cathedra definition or a binding on the entire church. And so per the Vatican I definition, this father who would have lived at the time of the council says that even in the maximal interpretation of Honorius's case, it would not contradict the Vatican I papacy as laid out by the document. And likewise, St. Leo II was able to confirm, this is what Ben said about receiving the council. Well, how's this reception garnered when St. Leo II is able to affirm the unerring faith of Rome on one hand and condemning Pope Honorius's negligence in the other? Clearly, it was the case of in the mind of Pope St. Leo II that these two things didn't necessarily contradict. And this is what we have as our basis for establishing ex cathedra definitions versus at most erring in a non-definitive sense. Likewise, Luigi did not establish a consistent view of ecumenical councils versus what is considered a robber synod and a true ecumenical council. I didn't really see much brought up referring specifically to the problems with the Second Council of Ephesus and St. Leo establishing it as a robber synod. He also failed to show how such honorifics necessarily debunk the papal claims, referring instead to this term is used here, and this term also seems to be used here, so therefore papal infallibility debunked. And likewise, it's interesting that he brings up St. Theodore the Studite, when St. Theodore the Studite would repeatedly write about Rome's unerring faith, even to other Greeks, and I believe that other Greek was the emperor of Constantinople at the time. So he's giving witness to other emperors, other Greek emperors, more mere flattery, but a true ecclesiological significance that Rome will have unerring faith. Likewise, Apostolic Canon 34 is referring to the local church as its confirmation of confirmation at the Synod of Antioch. Specifically refers to the Greek term that I'm not remembering at this time, it being applicable to local church, not the universal church or the view of Rome's primacy over the larger church. In fact, he's willing to concede that during a 35-year schism, which is based on determining whether Ephesus II or Chalcedon was correct, you cannot really know what side is correct out of, lay people necessarily needing to be theologians, right? We've also demonstrated the patristic reasoning for papal infallibility, and we have shown that popes since the beginning have exercised their ability to proclaim definitions in their extraordinary magisterium to a degree that would make Martin Luther or even the Jansenists blush. I want to end off with a beautiful quote from Theodore Abukora, who was a Melkite bishop, and by all accounts should have not needed to pay homage to Peter and the successors of Peter, considering that he was an Eastern figure. He says this: "As for Christ's words, I have prayed for you that you do not lose faith, but you have compassion on your brethren at that time and strengthen them." We do not think that he meant St. Peter himself. Rather, he meant nothing more than the holders of the seat of St. Peter, that is, Rome. Just as when he said to the apostles, I am with you always until the end of the age. He did not mean just the apostles themselves, but also those who would be in charge of their seats and their flocks. In the same way, when he spoke his last words to St. Peter, have compassion at that time and strengthen your brethren, your faith will not be lost, he meant by this nothing other than the holders of his seat, that is St. Peter's seat. And that is the same faith that that Catholics to this day continue to hold in step with the East. And I could see I yield the rest of my time.
All right. Thank you for your closing statement, gentlemen. Very entertaining and engaging debate. So I thank you guys both for participating. I hope the audience enjoyed. For those of you that are not familiar, here at the Crucible, we do things a little bit differently. After the closing statements have been completed, we consider the debate portion of the stream to be over, at which point the moderator can interact. We do have call-ins where people can come in and ask questions directly to either debater. We will get to super chats as well. We are on a bit of a time crunch, so I'm going to forego any questions that I have to make sure that the callers can get in and make their points on either side. We got a few back here already. If you want to call in, get in there ASAP, because I can't guarantee that we'll have time to get to everybody. We have a hard out here in about 49 minutes because we're going to go and raid the next stream that's coming up on the channel right after this. So we'll get to our first caller here. We've got Other Paul. Welcome.
What's up, boys? Good to see you again. Zen, Luigi, lovely to see you. Pinesap, how are you going today?
I'm doing good, buddy. How are you doing?
Lovely. It's a bit of a gloomy Australian morning, but it's nice and cool weather, so I do quite enjoy it. I'll get right to it. My question is for you, Pinesap. So we have in history, particularly, I think it's uncontroversial, that 2nd to 3rd centuries, they have less potential proofs for papal ecclesiology than, for example, the 4th and 5th century onwards. I don't think that's very controversial, whatever you think about those texts. But I think it also shows that there's not a big coincidence with respect to that gap in the number of texts, because we have, for example, Emperor Aurelian. He is actually appealed to by the Synod of Antioch in the late 3rd century in order to remove Paul of Samosata from the church because he refused to leave the building, literally. And Aurelian, being a pagan and one who was actually about to persecute the church, actually, before he died prematurely, before he could execute that, didn't really care for the church. But interestingly, he said that he would give over the church in Antioch to whoever was on the good books of the bishops of Italy and Rome. And so I think that shows significance in that the idea of proximity to the actual imperial seat, to the emperor, is actually an important factor with the imperial interaction with the city of Rome. And then, of course, going well into the Christian era, Theodosian Code, Title 17 of Book 16, where it speaks of necessity, where Theodosius, I think it's Theodosius, the Theodosius and Valentinian, they say that there must be agreement with the Church of Rome on basically everything because of the merits of St. Peter, but also because of the dignity of the city of Rome, as well as the authority of the Sacred Synod of Nicaea. Now, given those factors, my question is, given those factors and numerous other events that I think you guys have covered a few of them in this debate, does this not actually show that the authority of the Bishop of Rome and their ability to assert their authority was largely correlated with imperial sponsorship?
I don't necessarily think so. And I think the reason why is because we saw sort of injunctions of Constantinople being sort of a more precedent or a more shining city, right? As Rome kind of started to continue to decline. For instance, in though these are later councils or what have you, in later councils, you're still having these affirmations of Rome's primacy and supremacy of infallibility, even though really by all intents and purposes, you get in the West a little bit of like the Carolinian Renaissance, but for all intents and purposes, Constantinople is a more shining city on the hill than really even Rome is. And what we see consistently brought up about Rome is not necessarily imperial injunctions, because if imperial injunctions were the case, then Constantinople at that time would most certainly win out as being the see that presides kind of all over all the other sees, just because of its splendor being that not of Rome that's facing different declines and what have you. So I think the way that we see sort of the history of the church, it's received constantly, and I've read this in more than a few fathers, that it's not the sort of initial like imperial bolstering of Rome that gives it its primacy in the church, but rather the special charism given to St. Peter by our Lord.
Zen, I don't assume there's time for a follow-up.
No, you can go ahead.
Oh, okay, sweet. Yeah, I'm not sure how much I agree with that, because on the one hand, there are definitely appeals, of course, by Rome and others who support Rome to theological factors such as the merits of St. Peter as in the Theodosian Code or the primacy of Peter and what have you. But at the same time, the question actually mostly regards when and how strongly those assertions are actually made. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these are most strongly done when the Roman emperor or emperors, after the East-West split of the empire, when they are actually on the side of the Bishop of Rome. Because then we see the opposite happen as well. When the Bishop of Rome is not in the good books of the emperor, suddenly those claims start to drop quite heavily in certain respects. And I think one of them was brought up earlier with respect to Vigilius, where, as you said, Justinian was a bit of a bully. Agreed. He kind of just went in like, hey, yo, guys, I don't like Vigilius. Get this guy out. And then the other patriarchs and bishops like, yeah, yes, Justinian, yes, we declare his name alien from the church and the diptychs and what have you. So I do agree there's politicking going on there. But I think that actually just illustrates the point that where the material balance of power lies, that actually largely decides who gets to make what great claims of power, even if they do so on theological grounds. So in that case, Vigilius, of course, when the emperor was against the Bishop of Rome, the church gathered at that council, at least at that point, suddenly just didn't care really about the papal prerogatives the whole time and were, yep, cool, we consider his name alien, get out of here. But we maintain unity with the Church of Rome, which is interesting. There's a division between the Bishop of Rome and his see, but yeah. So I'm not sure, even with the assertion of theological claims, I don't think that shows that there really is any significant separation from the power of imperial sponsorship for the Church of Rome, especially, again, in light of the fact that these claims really do pick up post-Christianization of the empire.
Well, I think what I would respond to that is very simple. I mean, you see St. Menace of Constantinople, for instance, saying that he won't sign the documents of Constantinople II until specifically the approval on the part of the Bishop of Rome. So he recognizes that even though Justinian is kind of trying to force the situation, there is still this special primacy afforded to Rome that's kind of like unlike the other sees. And likewise, Justinian, you need to remember, deposed anyone who disagreed with him. So anyone who asserted the Petrine principle and said, hey, we're not going to sign till Rome gets here, he's like, okay, cool, you just lose your seat, right? So this hardly is a conciliar action. In fact, this is more in line with sort of the Caesaro-Papist conception of church ecclesiology that like we would go on to sort of criticize in the later Byzantine Empire or what have you. And I mean, we even see, if people want to cite examples of emperors trying to assert their power over the church or over and above the church, I mean, keep in mind post-schism, right? Post 1054, you have the injunctions of like William of Ockham or Marsilius of Padua, where they see, the emperor, right? The Holy Roman Emperor, if I'm not mistaken, being like over and above that of Rome, right? Well, does that suddenly mean that just because they assert that theological principle, that means the emperor is above and over Rome? No, most certainly not. What we have to keep in mind is this, again, goes back to what I keep stating about the sort of tumult with, human and divine, right? As laid out in Satis Cognitum. You'll see moments in church history where, because of the bullying of an emperor, popes will be like, okay, yep, we excommunicate Vigilius, right? We see that even happen post-schism with like various local synods that declared like anti-popes. But it doesn't necessarily mean that does not make the claims of Rome true. And we have to view it in the larger context in light of those events that went on during that time.
All right, if you want one last follow-up there, Paul, or if you want to go ahead, Luigi, go ahead.
This I just want to point out that Saint Justinian, his relics were found uncorrupted over 600 years after by Latin crusaders and a third-party historian. So he was a great saint. I just want to say that.
All right, Paul, if you want one more point here, just make it concise because we got to get moving.
No, yeah, I've said my piece here. I'm keen for more discussion with Pinesap in the future. I think that's just such a Chad response. Like, actually, Justinian is an incorrupt saint, so he's right. Absolutely, I do like that.
Exactly.
That's quite great. That's quite great. I do hear there's one or two Anglican saints who are actually allegedly incorrupt, so I'm going to start appealing to that too. Many thanks, and I'll hit it now. Good seeing you, boys.
God bless you, buddy.
Appreciate
God
the
bless
call
you.
in. Thanks, Paul. Next one we got here, Lemon. Welcome. Go ahead
Hello.
whenever you're ready.
So, blessed feast of the seven holy youths for those of us on the new calendar. I have a question for Pinesap, actually.
Yeah, what's up, Lemon?
I have 4 quotes here, and I have a question for you on this. Would you say that these are infallible, coming from the Pope? The sacrosanct Roman Church, founded by the voice of our Lord and Savior, firmly believes and preaches, so on and so forth. Whoever, therefore, having adverse and contrary opinions, the Church disapproves and anathematizes and declares to be foreign to the Christian body, which is the Church, so on and so forth. It's the Pope speaking for the Church. When everything I've said here so far is the Pope speaking on behalf of the Church. It firmly believes, professes, and proclaims, so on and so forth. And then the final quote, hence, if anyone, which God forbid, should dare willfully to deny or call into doubt that which we have defined, let him know that he has fallen away completely from the divine Catholic faith. Would you say those statements would begin to define something that is infallible?
What is the author of those following statements? Who is the
Well,
author?
the first 3 are from Cantate Domino, which is the Bull of Union.
Yes.
The 4th
Yes.
is from I don't remember the name of it, but it is the Apostolic Constitution, which defines Mary as having been not immaculately conceived, as having been assumed into heaven.
Yes, I would say that those are infallible statements. Absolutely.
Okay, then why on earth is paragraph 42? Paragraph 40. Wait a minute. Why on earth is paragraph 839, paragraph 840, paragraph 841, and 842 of the Catechism saying that we have the same church, that the Roman Catholic Church has the same faith? The last paragraph of Cantate Domino clearly says something else.
What do you mean by same? That's an ambiguous point you're bringing up. What do you mean same faith?
Well, let's start. I'm going to start with paragraph 841 of the Catechism. The Church's relationship with the Muslims. The plan of salvation also includes those who acknowledge the Creator in the first place, amongst them who are the Muslims. In Cantate Domino, we see clearly something different.
There's no contradiction. There's no contradiction.
Listen.
Nope, there's not. There's not. And I'll tell you why. It's natural theology. The teleology of... Nope, you're not going to interrupt me.
Let him finish.
Right.
Of the object of the Muslims' worship, and this is actually attested to by your own saint, Saint Gregory Palamas, so keep that in mind, right? Your own saint, Gregory Palamas, says that Muslims direct their worship towards God. Now, does that mean they worship truly or what have you? Absolutely not. They don't worship the full Holy Trinity. But Gregory Palamas could still acknowledge that they were intending to direct their object of worship towards the God of Abraham. And so that is perfectly consistent with Cantate Domino, because they won't be saved through that worship. That's not what the Church says. It's acknowledging a truth of natural theology in order to better affect evangelization. And if you don't believe me, Dominus Jesus says there is only salvation through Jesus Christ. That came out year 2000 after the Second Vatican Council.
Okay. So, and just one last quick thing. And this is also for us Orthodox, for those of us who have just heard that. The Catholic Church, firmly believes, professes, and proclaims that those not living within the Catholic Church, not only pagans, but also Jews and heretics and schismatics, cannot participate in eternal life, but will depart into everlasting fire, which was prepared for the devil and his angels, unless before the end of the life, the same, having been added to the flock, and that the unity of the ecclesiastical body is so strong that only those remaining in are the sacraments of the Church of benefit for salvation, and do fastings, almsgivings, and other functions of piety and exercises of the Christian service produce eternal reward, and that no one, whatever almsgiving he has practiced, even if he has shed blood in the name of Christ, can be saved, unless he has remained in the bosom of the unity of the Catholic Church. We do not share the same faith.
With who?
We Orthodox do not share the same faith as you as Roman Catholics. That is why there is a schism. That is why we as Orthodox Christians cannot...
because you guys are in schism with us. We affirm that.
Okay.
I don't understand what this point is trying to bring up.
Lemon, if you want to make a final concise point, and Pinesap, you can go ahead and respond, but we got to get moving.
I'm actually fine.
Okay. Thank you for the call in, Lemon. Appreciate it very much. Next caller we got here, Father Joseph Swaden. Welcome. You're on mute right now, but go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hey, welcome. May God bless you. First off, there were a lot of things covered in this debate, so it was pretty interesting. I saw some very interesting points. I think both of you represented your positions admirably, but because you brought up some obscure things, I can reference them pretty much with ease in my questions, and I have 3 of them. The first one, Pinesap, is we've talked about, for example, what happened with Vigilius. Subsequently, I'm sure you're aware of the schism of the 3 chapters, which lasted approximately 150 years, in which various Western sees broke communion with Rome, and in some cases remained in communion with the rest of the church through Constantinople. How does this fit in your model that everyone needs to be in communion with Rome when we're talking about people who are in communion with the church rejecting Rome for almost 150 years?
So it's a misapplication of the principle of Galatians 1:8. And we see this long after the Great Schism, for instance. I mean, the Lefebvrean Schism, for instance, they perfectly think that they are upholding the faith of the popes before Vatican II. Right?
If I may, because that's a misnomer.
Hold on, let him finish.
I just want to state one thing, though.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't remember I think his name is Ferrandis, if I'm not mistaken. I probably am butchering his name, though. I have it in my notes. But he states actually one of the reasons why he went into schism is because he saw the approval of Rome, of the Council of Chalcedon, as being sort of like an infallible strength. And so because he thought that essentially Vigilius contradicted that approval, that thus Vigilius would be like a heretic or what have you, right? Which this goes back to the conceptions of even Saint Robert Bellarmine or what have you, who don't think that a pope is above the faith. A pope is still bound to the faith, even though the fathers of Vatican I say this.
Okay, first off, you are comparing apples and oranges when you make a Lefebvre comparison. Lefebvre and the SSPX considered themselves in communion in some technical sense with Rome. These people broke communion with Rome because they thought they were heretics. This is a totally different scenario.
But they call Rome neo-modernist and neo-Protestant, and even Archbishop.
But they still believe they were part of the Catholic Church.
There would have to be a future
Rome,
council
right?
declaring the Rome.
Did the SSPX believe that Rome was still the head of the church or not?
Yeah, but I mean, so did the people who broke away from the church. You can see this in the works of St. Columbanus, where he still refers to Rome as the head of the church, but he not only thinks that Rome erred, he thought the entire Second Council of Constantinople, with the approval of all the patriarchs, erred as well, which would do actually more to say the other Paul's ecclesiology of Protestantism.
What you're saying is basically they were in communion with Rome inadvertently, even though that's the opposite of what they said. Cool. Let's get to the second question. You mentioned a letter to Clement from the Bishop of Kiev, a Pope Clement. Which Pope Clement was that?
That I would have to remember. It in the reference.
You mentioned it was around the 11th century. That's why it's very important.
Yeah, in the Orthodox Patristic Witness, I think it's either Pope Clement I want to say third, maybe it might be third. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Do you know the Pope Clement III was in the 11th century? He was the pope that is now considered an anti-pope because of the fact that during the investiture controversy with the Dictatus Papae, they deposed Hildebrand of Savano, who you understand as St. Gregory VII, and he was actually Pope Clement III, recognized as the real pope throughout the church while the Civil War was going on, was talking to the Orthodox because he held a similar ecclesiology, whereas Hildebrand's with the Dictatus Papae was creating the model of papal monarchy, which leads me to my third question, which
I wouldn't agree with that assertion.
Well, you can disagree, but the Dictatus Papae is pretty clear.
There's actually no proof that Dictatus Papae is an official decree binding on the entire church.
What there is proof of, however, is that the Synod of Brixen condemned him for those very ideas.
Hold on, one at a time here, guys.
And most scholars actually affirm that principle. I've looked in the scholarship on this.
Okay, the problem is that it doesn't matter because of all the canon law that was written afterwards by Deus Dedis and other canonists was following the same model as the Dictatus Papae. Saying the Dictatus Papae just makes it more obvious that it was the origin of the
your own canonist, Theodore Balsamon, cites the donation of Constantine for why the transfer from Rome to New Rome occurs. So he cited forgery from the transfer.
Right? Hang on, stop for a second.
Citing forgeries are just wrong things doesn't invalidate either.
But the Dictatus Papae is not
hang on. Stop for a second. Father Joseph, if you want to get to your third question, you'll have to do that now. If you want to keep arguing about this, that'll have to be your last point.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Okay. since we were just to kind of springboard off the models thing, are you aware? Do you know who Metropolitan Hincmar of Reims is?
Yes, I do.
And that was the 9th century, correct?
Yes, I do. I know probably what you're going to bring up, but just go ahead and
right.
say
His kind of his constitutions on the Metropolitanate and the independence of the Metropolitans in regards to Rome, which Rome itself accepted. This is occurring in the 9th century.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
The point is that the model of even metropolitan independence, not even patriarchal independence, was something that was foreign until the introduction of the Dictatus Papae, which is why there were so many civil wars.
So the interesting thing about Saint Himcar of Reims is actually the document that Ubi cites on his website. If you go to the conclusion, it says even against Himcar's statements in that document that he writes, he still ultimately is obedient to Rome. And he actually, this is recounted in Warren H. Carroll's work, he actually apologizes and says, I thank God for punishing me for my sins against the Apostolic See for this correction. So he still accepted a correction from Rome over and above even what he wrote. So it means that ultimately at the center of his ecclesiology was this acceptance of Rome's prerogatives to interject in the whole dispute that he was having over, I think it was the guy who was appointed, he didn't think was a very holy or pious man.
When Rome was Orthodox, of course, everybody accepted its headship. That's not under dispute. But when you did bring up Honorius and the papal oath, which you mentioned that the disparity between preaching the infallible faith but condemning Honorius's, I think you called it weakness. Are you aware that papal oaths from Vigilius until the 11th century required each papal claimant to condemn Honorius as a heretic?
The thing about Honorius being a heretic is, like I said with St. Cardinal Newman, even if I was to grant that he was a heretic, the capacity in which he erred would present no problem for Vatican I. Because he didn't make a ex cathedra binding statement upon the entire church.
We're not talking
in his letters to Sergius of
Constantinople. We're talking about 400 years.
Hey, make this your final point, by the way. Make this your final point.
My point was that to reduce it to this question of whether Honorius was a heretic or not is ridiculous. He was considered a heretic in the West by the popes for 400 years.
And even if he was, that's perfectly fine. That's what I'm telling you.
And then you're bringing up slap some Newman on it, and then that's not how it's going to work. Okay, well, whatever. Newman. It's fine. I'm done. Thank you so much, Luigi. Great job. Have a great.
Thank you.
Pinesap, if you want to respond to that, you can go ahead and do that. Or if you want,
he says slap some Newman on it, but it's like this is the Council Father of Vatican I, right? This would be like if I was, having injunctions against like the Palamite synods, for instance, and say Luigi, for instance, put forward an adequate defense, and I just said, oh, you're slapping some Philotheos Kikinos on it, right? It doesn't matter. It's like this is how the council was viewed. This is how the council was received by the people who lived at that time. And me using that as a defense of the council is perfectly licit. I don't see what the point of slapping some Newman is on that. I think that's just a little interjection that he wants to have to feel great about himself.
All right. And our next caller here, we got Maximus. Welcome. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to start with the example of St. Theodore that you brought up and his appealing to Rome. But one thing about and this will kind of lead into my broader question. I hope you'll be able to follow this. But one thing is that if you look at his writings, the main theme through his writings is the necessity of breaking communion over differences in faith. And then obviously he does that in the many controversies he was involved in. And then he would appeal to Rome. And I think if you look at that in the context of the modern Roman Catholic Church, it's almost inconceivable, right? That you could have like a bishop in Germany or a abbot of a monastery in Germany breaking communion over the German synodal way and then saying, well, actually, I'm still, in communion with Francis or appealing to Francis or something like that. And this kind of leads to my broader question, which is in these first 1,000 years of the church, although Rome definitely does have a very important place in resolving many of these disputes, you see all these very complicated situations in the Arian crisis, in iconoclasm, in monothelitism, where we have overlapping jurisdictions. We have Rome being with one party and being with another party, and people breaking communion with each other. And we talked about patriarch versus patriarch, the Acacian schism, all these different things. And it's if this principle that Rome is a constitutive head of the church, and that submission to Rome is necessary to be part of the body of Christ, if this was, impressed deeply in the Christian consciousness from the first century, if this was part of that faith that was handed on once, but from the apostles and prophets, like, how could we sort of have any of this? I mean, wouldn't it be super obvious that, in the Arian crisis, okay, everyone who's with Rome is acceptable and orthodox, and everyone who isn't. And it seems like this more modern principle goes back to the Gregorian reforms. And when you see things like, when we go from canon law being built upon all these different local councils to almost, being issued monarchically from Rome, I understand that a Roman Catholic could say, yes, the canonical structure of the church has changed in some ways, but the basic principles are still there. But I guess this kind of gets back to my basic point that it seems like this heresy, and you brought it up with conciliarism at the Council of Florence. You brought it up with people talking about the Pope being subject to the faith. It seems like this sort of conciliar heresy has been there throughout the entire church. And when I think of heresy, I think of a heresy appears, it's confronted at an ecumenical council within 100 years, 50 years, and it's condemned. And people are able to recognize it immediately when it enters the church, right? Arius was even condemned at local councils.
Here, try to get to your question to give Pinesap something to respond to.
Okay, my apologies. But, I'm just thinking, if you look at like Nicaea 2, this is the faith of the apostles, this is the faith of the Orthodox. Like, how was this false conception able to linger on throughout so much of church history? And also, if a pope really is subject to the faith, and the unity of faith is what's most important, like, what are we arguing about? Can't we just say in the Orthodox Church that, yeah, Rome has all these prerogatives, but eventually they lost the faith, and despite their divine mandate, it's ultimately secondary to the unity of the faith. So thank you.
So there was a lot there, but what you're trying to do is citing events of dissent in order to contest against the papal claims. But I could do the same for you. I mean, I could bring up the Raskol in Russia, right, where there was this massive schism over the changing of sort of the reform of the liturgy of the church and what have you, and say, well, look, man, there's this schism and you guys claim to be the one church. I mean, citing schisms or acts of dissent is not a good basis for establishing your argument on whether something is true or not. Schisms and dissent happens all the time in the church. I mean, why post schism? It's like you have, anti-popes that pop up. You have local synods that think that they can still condemn a pope or what have you. Like, citing people who just happen to dissent from the faith works against your favor, because you have many examples of people who, again, did not hold the same Eastern Orthodox faith, broke away over issues of like jurisdiction or what have you. But if I use that to challenge you, you would of course say, well, there's still one body, and one example of dissent doesn't necessarily mean that a principle about that one body is untrue. Likewise, I'm trying to remember the second part of your question. That was kind of a lot. What did you say for the second part?
Oh yeah. So like, if the Pope is ultimately subject to the faith, like, why can't we just say, yeah, the Pope has all these prerogatives, but he lost the faith, and thus.
Well, because there's this perpetuity of the apostolic see. I mean, you cited Nicaea 2, and again, Nicaea 2 leaves in the letter, in the Greek version of the letter, keep in mind, not the Latin one, but in the Greek one as well, the perpetuity of the Roman see, specifically in, I believe it was Pope Hadrian's letter to St. Tarcisius. Now, that's a little bit more than just an honorific. It's like if they were willing to trim down some other claims, but they left that in there in the Greek version of the Acts, why would they leave that in there if they didn't believe it? That seems a little suspect, especially when we see that same claim repeated by Pope St. Leo, Pope St. Gelasius, Philip at the Council of Ephesus, and what have you.
Unfortunately, Maximus, we're not going to have time because we got a few more callers to get through here, but I do appreciate the call in. Thank you very much. Next one, we've got Craig Truglia. But welcome, Craig. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Good. My question, another for Pinesap. Sorry, not fair. Everyone's beating up on it.
Before you go, I know real quick. I know people are saying there's not enough Catholic representation here in the call-ins. You guys are more than welcome. We don't have a lot of time left, but all Roman Catholics are welcome to call in and question Luigi. That we don't hold anyone back or silence any worldviews here. So if you're Catholic and you want to call in, get in the queue. But go ahead, Craig.
Well, thankfully, I have a quick question. So, how clear would St. Pope Martin have to be in order to communicate to your satisfaction, Pinesap, that when he said it was not in his power to appoint a Patriarch of Jerusalem, that it actually wasn't in his power to appoint a Patriarch of Jerusalem?
So are what you're asking?
How would you like him to word it better in a realistic way for him to communicate that it wasn't in his power to appoint a Patriarch of Jerusalem?
I would have to see a claim made that on the Matthean principle itself did not give him that power to do it.
All right. Thank you for answering my question.
All right. Is that all you got, Craig?
Well, don't want to beat up. I want to keep beating up on him, but I think that's Luigi.
Well, while Craig is up here, I got to give him credit. He helped me a ton in studying for this debate, and his book, Rise and Fall of the Papacy, is phenomenal, and everyone needs to go get it.
Yeah, it was also cited by Pinesap, so I appreciate it. But I do think when we look at these historical sources, when someone says it's not my power to do this, and if we start saying, well, he was talking normatively about the synod, this, that, the other thing, that's nowhere in the conversation there. So it seems that we create this impossible burden of proof for someone to communicate that Vatican I papacy is just not possible. And I just find that interesting because that always gets posed on the Orthodox side. But I mean, this quote's been out here for a while now, and the best response is, well, if we read this 1,000 different ways other than what it says, then maybe it doesn't mean what it means. And I just found that very interesting because I think that's the best response that the Roman Catholic side could come up with. So I give my congratulations to you, Pinesap.
All right. Well, we appreciate the call in, Craig. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Craig.
Next one here, we got Ephraim. Welcome. I do need you to be concise. We got about maybe 3 minutes tops for this call, and then we got to move on.
Okay, thank you. I actually want Luigi and Pinesap to respond to this. What do you guys think of this quote from Eric Ibarra? He says, "It never ceases to amaze me how Catholics are so quick to flock to belittle the significance of the condemnation of Pope Honorius. And here we might as well add Vigilius too. A total of 5 of all the ecumenical councils in the first millennium either issued or rehearsed an official condemnation of a Roman pontiff for issuing what was understood to be heretical doctrine via his teaching constitutions. These anathemas were official and are still laid in the acts of these councils. Rome has never rescinded them. Therefore, I continue to be amazed at how quick we flock to the unofficial speculations of theologians and apologists to remove these historical facts."
I would have to see the rest. I would have to see the rest of that quote. I think that
that's all it is. That's all it is. It's from Twitter. That's all it is. You can look it up on his Twitter page.
That's perfectly fine. I'm going to go back and read his book and see what else he has
Please
to say
do.
because
Please
I don't
do.
necessarily trust just a initial reading of a
Go
quote.
ahead. You can go look it up on his Twitter. I just want to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah,
I mean,
I referenced. Sorry, were you not done?
No, go right ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say I think I misspoke. I think I said 6. But 5 councils. I referenced that quote earlier in the debate. And yeah, I mean, it's obviously significant that 5, I think 3 of those 5, at least 3 of those 5 are ecumenical councils. So at the very least, they didn't see the Pope as being indefectible.
All right, Ephraim, do you have a follow-up?
I'm just waiting for Pinesap's response.
So which Pope is being condemned, Honorius or Vigilius?
Both Honorius and Vigilius. And keep in mind what
which council is being referenced.
He's not talking about a council in here. I'm quoting Eric Ibarra. I just want your response.
That's fine. I'm asking you currently, what council is condemning Vigilius? Honorius, that's fine. I think I sufficiently answered the case of Honorius.
But you didn't, because the church, you're claiming in the debate that the church understood Vatican I in the first millennium.
Yes,
yet
and you know that there's books
the actions
heresy,
of the
like
church.
John of St. Thomas writes about the treatment of papal heresy.
Okay, can I finish now?
Yeah, fine. Go ahead.
So the actions of the church.
Point here, Ephraim.
Yeah, my point is the actions of the church say otherwise than what Pinesap is trying to claim in this debate. That's my point.
Yeah, I don't think so.
All right.
Eric Ibarra disagrees.
Thank you for the call in, Ephraim. Appreciate that very much. Last one here. I'm not even going to try to read this, but welcome. You're muted right now. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Hello, brothers and brother Ben.
Hello.
Luigi. When you read it is George, for you guys to be like, let's call me George. So anyway, I wanted to ask, can you hear me?
Yeah,
the sound quality is a little off.
Yeah.
It's kind of hard for me to hear you.
Yeah, you're very muffled.
Let me try to remove headphones. How about now?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
much
I can
better.
hear you way
Much
better.
better.
Okay, that's perfect.
Okay. I remove headphones. So
Oh,
I wanted to ask Pinesap. You said that titles of the Pope tell some kind of theological truth, but if we read saints from first centuries, they called the Roman Church double apostolic. So if they called the Roman Church double apostolic and gave Paul and Peter same importance, so why now, after 2,000 years, they give Peter more importance than Paul? So, some easy question.
So this is a common misunderstanding. Oftentimes Orthodox will cite the condemnation about the succession of St. Peter in relation to Paul, but what that actually is referring to is the idea, and you see this in the early church, that Peter's successors is singular. However, there's a spiritual significance of both St. Peter and Paul helping establish the church at Rome and the apostolic seat, right? And in fact, this is why we celebrate today in the liturgy, right, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul. We still attribute that kind of importance that Paul played in the role of establishing the church at Rome. It's still celebrated in our liturgy. Even even an ultramontanistic figure like Dom Prosper Granger refers, I believe he writes about the feast of Saints Peter and Paul and talks about that sort of double apostolic importance in his devotional work. And keep in mind, he wrote one of probably the best defenses of Vatican I, addressed to a Gallican bishop at the time, called The Papal Monarchy.
Yes, I understand that, you are worshiping still Paul and you are not disregarding him completely. But again, my point is that it seemed that in first century they didn't make such a large difference. So where they will put Peter much higher. I read some writing that even they said that Pope can disregard Saint Paul, Apostle Paul writing, but I'm not sure. I will not
I think that's a mischaracterization of the writing. I think I know what writing you're referring to, and it's kind of the condemnation of succession. But it's more nuanced than that. It's not like, oh, we can disregard Saint Paul or throw him out. It's just saying that when we say that they're successors to Saint Peter, it's that succession from Saint Peter in a singular sense, but there still is that significance. I mean, this is even still in our liturgy of Saints Paul and Peter helping establish the church at Rome and kind of creating this apostolic seat that we see presiding over the entire church in love.
Unfortunately, caller, we don't have time for a follow-up, but I do appreciate the call in.
And it's Pope Innocent X in Denzinger 1999 is where he condemns that proposition, for anyone curious.
All right, and that'll do it for our call-in segment. I do want to get through the super chats before we wrap it up here. We should be able to make it out in time. There's not a lot of substance in the super chats, but some of them are. Justin Henley, $2 says, "Don't break TOS. Don't make us ban you. No simping. We have had to implement the ban hammer a couple of times tonight." But, thank you, Justin Henley. Cult of Modernism, $20 says, "How does Pinesap reconcile Hayek Santa with Pastor Aeternus?" Hayek Santa says, "Everyone of whatever state or dignity, even papal, is bound to obey it, the council, in those matters which pertain to the faith."
Yeah, so Cardinal Brandmuller actually has a really good piece on it. I knew probably someone would bring, I didn't think Luigi would, since we were sticking to the first millennium. I knew someone would bring that up, but Cardinal Brandmuller, who's one of the church's most eminent historians, essentially has a piece on that. And he kind of says that even though that was decreed during the council, that, subsequent popes did not accept that part of the Council of Constance. So that part was not applicable to the church at large, right? Even though other parts of the council were accepted. But that's me shooting from the hip. I would need to go back and read exactly what Cardinal Brandmuller said.
All right. JoJo membership chat says, "Yo guys, am I tripping or did Zen's forehead get even bigger since last time? I don't know. Maybe.
You were wearing a hat last time.
Yeah, well, I was hiding my power level.
Man doesn't even have a five head, dude. It's what are they talking about?
You got to know the lore. That's all I can say. You got to know the lore. Wicked Wally $5 says, "Since Zen's here, I got some old school Wally for everyone. What's the best way to secure your hat? By using your caps lock." Thank you, Wicked Wally. Appreciate the dad joke. Cult of Modernism $2 says, "Pinesap conceded." I'm not sure what point he's talking about there.
I don't know what he's talking about.
It was earlier in the debate. It might have been a specific point. NS for $2 says, "Chat, am I cooked, Luigi?"
I am cooked.
Hibbity Dibbity $50 super sticker says absolutely nothing. Thank you very much, Hibbity Dibbity. Logan Messiak $5 says, "Question for EO. Can you explain Eusebius book 2, chapter 14, page 6? Go straight there, Luigi. Do it now. When he says about Peter, greatest and strongest of the apostles, speaker for all the others."
Yeah, we agree that Peter is the chief apostle. It's very clear that he would exercise his authority in, conciliar model. But we would say, I have the quote about Antioch. I have a quote about Alexandria that are both Petrine. And there's a sense in which every bishop is Peter. And Ubi Petrus has an excellent paper on all the patristics that say that every bishop is Peter. So that's the conciliar or the patristic consensus. So we're fine saying that Peter was the chief apostle.
All right. FB $5 says, "So I heard Luigi is a better debater than Mario. Mario bet he can probably jump higher too."
Mario catches praise in all my debates.
He kind of deserves it. Those of you that haven't seen it,
can I insert something real quick? I think there was a misunderstanding. During
about
my
this
closing someone no, it was about the whole I conceded thing. I meant I yield my time. I was not saying I conceded the debate. I think there was a misunderstanding there.
Oh,
no. It says Penguin Zio says. It says Penguin Zio said before he logged off the internet. It was a misinput. I meant to say I yielded time, not that I conceded the debate. That was a misunderstanding.
Okay. All right. Christian Mario $2 says, "Here to say my dog Luigi has been mewing."
That's true. That legit is true. I can see it.
All right. Dr. Tetanus says for $5, "I'm a filthy prot, phone posting from a tree in Appalachia. This sounded like two lawyers resting their cases using the same eyewitnesses and evidence." I think that's a compliment for both of you.
I guess.
I think you both did a good job.
It was a tough debate because, what I was worried with for the first 1,000 years is you're covering such a large span of history. There's so many little intricate details, especially when you get in the works of Price. So, like, Luigi would bring something up. I'm like, man, I don't remember reading that. I got to go back and research it. And then maybe I'd bring something up. And it was a good back and forth. I loved seeing it.
All right. Christian Mario, another $2 says, "St. Justinian respecters, tap in." Thank you, Christian Mario. Catholic Rock, $20 says absolutely nothing. Appreciate that, Catholic Rock. There's our Catholic representation, guys.
There you go.
He says nothing. Last one here over on the Dono chat side. Cameron for $4 says, "Question for Pinesap: do you think that anti-popes existing in and of itself is contra papacy?"
No, actually. In fact, there's really good treatments of this in some of our best theological manuals. And one I would specifically refer to you on, I think it's called, I don't want to say Church of Christ, but it's, I think, called On the Church by Saliveri. And he actually treats the Great Western Schism, right? This is something you hear papal opponents bring up a lot because they're like, hey, you guys are talking about almost sort of epistemological certainty in a certain way. How could this exist when there were three popes, right? 2 anti-popes and 1 true pope. And what we would say is that there was not culpability for those who had followed those anti-popes of committing the sin of schism. So they would have maybe at most been what's called materially schismatic, meaning that they had no intention to go into schism with the true Church of Christ, but they just merely from the, complicated situation at the time had no way of knowing who the true claimant was, hence why the Council of Constance was called in the first place.
All right. And we did get a couple more super chats here last minute. Christian Mario $5 says, "I want to find something I disagree with Zen on, so I can debate him and beat him with all that trash he's been talking. My return is imminent. We're waiting.
I'll moderate.
Mario.
I'll moderate. Can I moderate?
Luigi will moderate. Yeah, DM us, Mario. We'll figure something out. I want the Mario redemption arc. I'm waiting for it. I've been waiting for it since you fell and crashed and burned the first time.
He's working on something.
And then last one here, Michael Z, $5 says, not religious myself, but Pinesap displayed a professional and scholarly performance in this debate. Is he a Catholic scholar? He should debate Dyer. I don't know if that was sarcastic or not, but yeah.
So I don't know if that's sarcastic. If Michael's being sarcastic, it's like, okay. But if you're being sincere, I'm not a scholar by any means. I actually am going to see if I can get a theological degree at St. John Vianney Seminary eventually. But I actually did debate Dyer a little while ago. And then what was awesome after, and Luigi was on this stream too, we had a hangout stream where we all like reconciled, and it was awesome. It was so good. So me and Dyer did debate a little while ago and stuff like that. But after that, we were totally cool and awesome and stuff like that.
All right, and last one here. They keep coming in last minute here. But Mud, $5 says, I didn't listen to the debate, but I assume Zen's galactically huge forehead won the debate without the slightest inconvenience. So true. So true. Thank you, Mud. Appreciate that. That should do it for all the Super Chats. Let me just make sure. Yep, that'll do it for all our Super Chats. All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for tuning in and participating here. Thank you, everyone who watched in the audience. Before we go, Pinesap, one last time, if you want to shout yourself out, tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, so Pinesap is my YouTube channel. That's just my name that you can see on screen. Pinesap3 on Instagram. I'm like at 56,000 followers. I'm surprised I haven't been banned yet. That's crazy. And then at Pinesap3 Wask on Twitter. I think it's with a capital P in the name Pinesap, and then the narrow way on Telegram.
All right, and Luigi, go ahead, shout yourself out. Tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, Lang.Luigi on Instagram, LangLuigi _ on Twitter, Mere Christian on TikTok, and please get Rise and Fall of the Papacy. And I also want to thank Ubi Petrus for all the help as well, and go check his website out as well.
All right, thanks everyone for tuning in. That will do it for the debate. We are going to raid directly into the whatever cross stream, so stick around. It's gonna take you straight there, but that'll do it for this stream. So from all of us here at the Crucible to all of you in Crucible Land, have a wonderful night.